The debt was $43.
That was what brought Caleb Ryder into Red Mesa on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the sky had gone the color of old pewter and the wind off the mesa carried enough bite to make a man pull his collar up and keep his head down. $43 in change, owed by a farmer named Denton Reed for a mule Caleb had sold him on credit 14 months ago. It wasn't a fortune. For a man of Caleb's holdings, 300 acres of working ranch land, 40 head of cattle, a crew of 8, $43 was the kind of money that went into a ledger and mostly stayed there, accumulating dust alongside half a dozen other small debts that Caleb tracked more out of principle than necessity. But principle mattered to him. It always had. He tied his horse outside the Dusty Flats Saloon, which was the only establishment in Red Mesa that stayed open past 4 in the afternoon, and also the most likely place to find Denton Reed at any hour of the day. The town itself wasn't much to look at. A main street, a feed store, a post office with a sagging porch, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and roughly 40 souls who scraped their livings out of the hard clay soil and called it enough. Caleb had passed through a dozen towns like it in his 38 years. They all had the same particular smell: dust, manure, wood smoke, and something underneath all of it that might have been desperation, if desperation had a scent. He pushed through the saloon doors and let his eyes adjust. The place was dim and smelled of spilled beer and tobacco. 3 men played cards at a corner table. The barkeep, a wide man named Tolly with a gray mustache the size of a small animal, stood polishing a glass that was never going to be truly clean. 2 ranch hands Caleb didn't recognize were drinking quietly at the far end of the bar, not looking at anyone. And there was Denton Reed. He was sitting at a table near the middle of the room, which told you something about him right away. A man with nothing to hide, or a man too drunk to care about positioning himself near an exit. His hat was pushed back on his head, his shirt was stained in a way that suggested it had been stained for some time, and he had the particular slack-jawed look of someone who had started drinking before noon and never quite stopped. There was a bottle in front of him, nearly empty. There was also a young woman standing beside his table. Caleb noticed her the way you notice something wrong in a familiar room. Not immediately, but then all at once. She was maybe 20, 22 at the outside. Dark hair pinned back with a couple of loose strands falling across her forehead. She wore a plain gray dress that had been mended in at least 3 places Caleb could see from the doorway, and she was standing very still in the particular way that people stand when they are trying not to draw attention to themselves while also being unable to leave. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her eyes were on the floor. Caleb walked to Reed's table. He pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited. "Denton." Reed looked up. Something flickered behind his eyes, a recognition, maybe guilt, maybe just the reflexive wariness of a man who owed money catching sight of the person he owed it to. "Ryder," he said. "Didn't know you were coming today." That's generally how debt collection works. Reed reached for his bottle, poured himself a measure he didn't need. "I don't have it," he said, not bothering with any preamble. "Not the whole thing. I had a bad year. You know how it is." "I know how it is," Caleb said. "I also know you've had 14 months to come up with $43, and the last 3 times I sent word you didn't answer." "I was going to." Reed waved a hand vaguely. "I was working on it." Caleb looked at the nearly empty bottle on the table. He didn't say anything about it. There was no point. "All right," he said. "What can you offer me? Payment plan, property, stock? I'm not unreasonable, Denton. Give me something workable." Reed shifted in his seat. He glanced up at the young woman still standing beside the table, and something passed across his face that Caleb couldn't quite read. Then Reed looked back at him with the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was only now finding the nerve to say it out loud. "I've got her," Reed said. A beat of silence. "I beg your pardon?" Caleb said. "Savannah." Reed jerked his chin toward the woman. "She's my daughter. Good worker. No complaints about her from anybody who's hired her out. You take her for 6 months, put her to work on that ranch of yours, and we call the debt settled." He said it the way a man might offer a wagon wheel or a length of fence post. Practical. Transactional. With his eyes already sliding away like he didn't much want to look at the thing he was describing. Caleb went very still. He'd heard a lot of things in $43 worth of conversation over the years. He had not expected this. He looked at the woman, Savannah, and she had lifted her eyes from the floor now. She was looking at her father with an expression that wasn't surprise. That was the part that hit Caleb low in the chest, the part he couldn't quite shake off afterward when he thought about this moment. She wasn't surprised. She'd known this was coming. Maybe she'd been brought here for exactly this purpose, positioned beside the table like a piece of collateral her father had decided to use. Her jaw was set. Her hands, still folded in front of her, had gone white at the knuckles. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. "No, Papa. You're not doing this." Reed's face changed. The slack looseness of the drunk hardened into something uglier. "You don't get to say no," he said. "You live under my roof. You eat my food.
I earn my keep, and you know it."
Her voice was still that careful, controlled quiet, and Caleb could hear the effort it was costing her. "I've been earning my keep since I was 12 years old. You are not settling a debt with me like I'm a—" Reed stood up. He was faster than a man 3 drinks past sense had any right to be. His hand came across and caught her across the cheek with a crack that stopped every conversation in the room. Savannah's head snapped to the side. She caught herself on the edge of the table, one hand gripping the wood, and for a moment she just stood there, with her hair fallen forward across her face and her chest heaving. The saloon had gone absolutely silent. Reed sat back down like nothing had happened, picked up his glass. "She's young and strong," he said to Caleb, as if they were simply resuming the conversation. 6 months. Fair trade. Caleb had not moved during any of this. He had a certain kind of stillness when he was angry. Not the coiled, visible tension of a man about to throw a punch, but something quieter and more deliberate that people who knew him well had learned to recognize as more dangerous than the other kind. The men at the card table had stopped pretending to play cards. Tolly behind the bar had set down his glass. Caleb looked at Savannah. She had straightened up. She had pushed her hair back with one hand. There was a red mark across her cheekbone that was going to become a bruise by nightfall, and her eyes were bright with something that was not— he noticed this specifically— tears. It was something harder than tears. She met his gaze. Her chin came up slightly, which told him something about her that $43 couldn't buy. He looked back at Reed. "Here's what's going to happen, Denton," Caleb said. His voice was perfectly even. "I'm going to pay off this table. I'm going to walk your daughter out of this saloon, and then I'm going to have my lawyer draw up a work contract that is legal, binding, and pays her a fair wage." He reached into his coat pocket and set 3 bills on the table. "Not $43. More than $43. Significantly more. That covers what you owe me, and it covers a fair wage advance for the first month of her employment. After that, she's paid weekly, and every dollar goes to her, not to you. We're settled." Reed stared at the money, then at Caleb. She's a grown woman," Caleb said, "and I've just made her an employment offer. Whether she takes it is her decision." He looked at Savannah. "Miss Reed, would you like a job?" The silence in the room stretched out long enough that Caleb heard the wind pushing against the saloon's front window. Savannah looked at her father. Something moved across her face. Grief, maybe, or the last remnant of a hope she'd given up on a long time ago. Then she looked at Caleb, and the calculation in her eyes was not the calculation of a woman who trusted easily. It was the calculation of a woman who had learned that trust was a thing you spent carefully or not at all. "What kind of work?" she said. "Whatever needs doing," Caleb said. "I run a working ranch, cooking, cleaning, helping with the hands' meals, looking after my daughter. She's 8 and she's a handful. I won't lie to you. Fair pay. Your own room. Nobody puts a hand on you." Savannah was quiet for another moment. Then she picked up the small cloth bag she had apparently set on the floor beside her father's chair. All her worldly possessions, Caleb would later learn, amounted to what fit in that bag. And she said, "All right." Reed shoved his chair back. "Now hold on. We're done here, Denton." Caleb stood. He was taller than Reed by several inches, and he let that fact occupy the space between them for a moment. "You have your money. I have an employee. Anything else you want to say to your daughter, you can say it now, because after today she's on my payroll and under my protection. And if you come onto my property to cause trouble, I will have you removed by the county sheriff before you get to the gate." Reed looked at his daughter. His mouth worked like he was going to say something. Whatever it was, he swallowed it, picked up his glass instead. Caleb walked Savannah out of the dusty flat saloon into the gray October afternoon, and behind them the door swung shut, and the murmur of voices started up again almost immediately. Because in a town the size of Red Mesa, a thing like that would be talked about for weeks. They rode back toward the ranch, mostly in silence, which suited Caleb well enough. He'd given her his spare horse, a steady gray mare named Opal who hadn't spooked at anything in 6 years, and Savannah sat the saddle like someone who had ridden working horses her whole life, easy and economical, not the decorative kind of riding you saw sometimes with women from town families. She knew what she was doing. He waited until they'd cleared the town limits before he said anything at all. "The contract will be proper," he said. "I meant what I told him. You'll have your own room in the main house. There's one off the kitchen that's been sitting empty. You'll eat with the household, not separately. My cook, Mrs. Drummond, she runs the kitchen and she's particular about it, but she's fair." Savannah was looking at the road ahead. "How old did you say your daughter was?" 8. Her name's Lily." "Her mother?"
Died when Lily was 4. Fever. He said it the way a man says a fact he has repeated enough times that it no longer cuts him in the place it used to, though Caleb had private doubts about whether that was entirely true. Savannah nodded slowly. "I'm good with children," she said. Not boasting, just stating a fact, the same way she might tell him she knew how to mend a shirt or saddle a horse. "I figured," he said. Another stretch of silence. The road bent around a stand of cottonwoods, and the flat clay ground gave way to the grass that meant they were getting close to better land. His land, the kind of land that had taken him 15 years and a fair amount of bad luck to accumulate. "You didn't have to do that," Savannah said abruptly. Caleb glanced at her. "Do what?" "Pay more than he owed you. You didn't have to do that." She kept her eyes on the road. The bruise on her cheek had started to show properly now, a darkening along the bone. "You could have just said you weren't interested and ridden back home." "I could have," he agreed. "So why didn't you?" He thought about that for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wasn't sure he could explain it without sounding like he was making himself out to be something he wasn't. "Because nobody should have to stand in a saloon and watch their father sell them like livestock," he said finally. "And because you didn't look like a woman who'd been given very many fair offers in her life." Savannah didn't respond to that, but he noticed her shoulders drop very slightly, a small release of tension that she probably wasn't even aware of. The ranch was called the Double R, though Caleb had inherited that name from the previous owner and had never felt strongly enough about it to change it. It sat at the end of a half-mile track off the main road, a collection of buildings arranged around a hard-packed central yard. The main house, the bunkhouse, the barn, a smaller equipment shed, and a chicken coop that had survived 2 bad storms and seemed determined to survive a third. The main house was timber-framed in 2 stories, not grand by any Eastern standard, but solid, with a wide porch across the front that caught the afternoon sun. When they rode in, 2 of the hands were mending fence near the barn. A third, a young man named Cody Marsh, barely 20, all elbows and enthusiasm, was crossing the yard with a bucket in each hand and nearly walked into his own feet when he saw the woman riding in beside Caleb. "Mr. Ryder," he said, stopping. His eyes went to Savannah with the particular transparency of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise where his attention was. "You bring somebody back from town?" "New employee," Caleb said, swinging down from his horse. "Savannah Reed. She'll be helping Mrs. Drummond with the house and looking after Lily. Savannah, this is Cody Marsh. He's been with me about a year and he works hard, though he tends to drop things when he's distracted." Cody went red in a way that was almost impressive. I wasn't, he looked at Savannah. "Ma'am, welcome." "Thank you," Savannah said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but might have been a near relation to one. Mrs. Drummond was in the kitchen, as she almost always was, a small, iron-haired woman of 60-something who had been cooking for ranch crews since before most of her current employers were born and had very clear opinions about her domain, her recipes, and the correct way to do nearly everything. She took one look at Savannah, at the bag in her hand, the mended dress, the bruise that was now fully visible on her cheekbone, and then at Caleb, and her expression shifted through several things in rapid succession before settling into something brisk and practical. "Room off the kitchen's got a good bed," she said. "I'll put fresh linen on it. You hungry?" "I'm all right," Savannah said. "That wasn't what I asked," Mrs. Drummond said pleasantly. "Sit down, there's stew."
Something in the matter-of-factness of that. No pity, no performance, just a bowl of stew offered to someone who looked like they hadn't eaten a proper meal recently, seemed to catch Savannah off guard. She sat down at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Drummond put a bowl in front of her, and that was that. Caleb excused himself to find his lawyer's address and get a letter written before the week was out. He found Lily where she usually was at this hour, in the barn, allegedly brushing down one of the horses, but actually sitting in an empty stall reading a book she'd borrowed from the school teacher. She was 8 years old and small for it, with her mother's dark eyes and a habit of asking questions that went sideways in directions Caleb wasn't always prepared for. She looked up when he came in. "You're back," she said, with the tone of someone confirming a hypothesis. "I am," he said. "We have a new person staying at the house. She's going to help Mrs. Drummond and look after you a bit." Lily considered this. What happened to her face? Caleb paused. He'd hoped to avoid this specific topic for at least 24 hours. She had some trouble before she came here. What kind of trouble? The kind that's behind her now. Lily looked at him with her mother's eyes, which had always made it harder than it should have been to deflect questions. Did somebody hurt her? Yes, he said, because he'd made a decision early in her life that he wasn't going to lie to her about the existence of hard things, only calibrate how much detail she needed. But she's safe now, and I expect you to be kind to her. I'm always kind, Lily said, with the perfect confidence of a person who has never seriously questioned this about themselves. You once told Mrs. Drummond her biscuits tasted like chalk. That was honesty, not unkindness. Lily. She sighed with the weight of someone asked to compromise their principles. I'll be kind, she said. Can I meet her now? Lily met Savannah that evening at the dinner table, which in the Double R household meant the large table in the kitchen where everyone who worked the house ate together. Caleb, Lily, Mrs. Drummond, and whoever happened to be in from the bunkhouse. That night, it was Cody and two older hands named Walt Greer and Harlan Boucher, who had between them about 60 years of ranch work and the kind of weathered quietness that comes with knowing what matters and what doesn't. Savannah sat at the end of the table with her hands folded in her lap, waiting for a signal that it was all right to eat, and Caleb noticed that, the waiting, though he didn't call attention to it, just passed her the bread directly and said, "Help yourself?" in a tone that was meant to settle the question of whether she was welcome at the table. Lily, seated directly across from Savannah, stared at her for approximately 45 seconds before saying, "Your hair is really long." "Lily," Caleb said. "It is, though." Lily looked at Savannah. "Can you braid it? Mine always falls out." "Usually it falls out because you put it in yourself," Mrs. Drummond observed. "Mrs. Drummond puts them too tight," Lily said. "No offense." "Some taken," Mrs. Drummond said serenely. Savannah's mouth did that near smile thing again. "I can braid hair," she said to Lily. "If you want, I can show you how to do your own so it holds." Lily turned to Caleb with the expression of someone who has just been told that Christmas will be arriving ahead of schedule. "She can braid," she informed him. "I heard," he said. "Can she stay?" "She already said she was staying. I mean, forever." "Lily, I'm just asking." Savannah laughed. It was a small sound, surprised out of her, and it changed her face entirely, took the careful watchfulness out of it, and left something younger and warmer in its place. It was the first time Caleb had heard her laugh, and it struck him as the kind of laugh that hadn't been used very often, and probably should have been. Walt Greer, who had not said a single word through any of this, quietly helped himself to more stew, and kept his opinions to himself, which was what Walt Greer did about most things. The contract arrived from Caleb's lawyer in Prescott 8 days later, written out in proper legal language, 2 copies, both signed by Caleb and witnessed. He brought it to Savannah at the kitchen table one morning before the breakfast was done and set it in front of her. "Take your time reading it," he said. "Ask me anything you're not clear on." She read it slowly and carefully, which told him she could read well, which for a farmer's daughter in this part of the territory wasn't something he'd taken for granted. She got to the wages section and looked up at him. "This is too much," she said. "It's the going rate for a household manager," he said, "which is more or less what you'll be doing. Mrs. Drummond cooks, but she's getting older and she'll appreciate the help. You're managing the household, looking after Lily when I can't, That's skilled work. I've never been paid this much for anything. Then it's been too long coming. He pushed the second copy toward her. That one's yours to keep. She looked at the paper in her hands for a moment. Then she picked up the pen he'd left on the table, signed her name, and slid the first copy back to him. Her handwriting was clean and careful. A person who'd been taught to write by someone who cared about it. Caleb folded his copy and put it in his breast pocket. "Welcome to the Double R, Miss Reed," he said. "Properly, this time." "Savannah," she said. "You can call me Savannah." "Caleb," he said. She nodded once, with the particular gravity of someone accepting a thing that costs something to accept. Then she stood up, put on her apron, and went to help Mrs. Drummond with the bread, because there was work to do, and she had never in her life seen any point in sitting still when there was work to do. October gave way to November, and November settled in with the particular cold of high desert country. Not the wet, brutal cold of the north, but a dry, sharp cold that came down off the mesa at night and left frost on the water trough every morning. The ranch contracted inward the way all working ranches do in winter, pulling people closer to the fire and the barn, reducing the daily circuit to what was necessary and no more. Savannah had been at the Double R for 3 weeks when Caleb first noticed that the hands had started treating her differently. It wasn't a dramatic change. It was the slow accumulation of small things, Walt Greer holding the barn door for her without being asked, Cody offering to carry the heavy supply boxes from the wagon when deliveries came, Harlan Boucher saying, "Good morning," to her first instead of waiting to be spoken to, which was not something Harlan did with anyone as a rule. The men who ate at the house table started setting their plates on the sideboard when they were done instead of leaving them where they sat, because Savannah had asked once, politely, and they had done it, and then kept doing it without being asked again. She earned things rather than taking them, which Caleb respected. She didn't arrive trying to charm anyone or position herself as something she wasn't. She did the work that was in front of her. She did it well, and she paid attention to what people needed before they said it out loud. Mrs. Drummond, who had greeted the idea of help in her kitchen with the mild suspicion of a craftsman wary of interference, had within 2 weeks begun consulting Savannah on the week's menus, which was roughly the equivalent of being granted citizenship. With Lily, it was something else entirely. Lily was not a difficult child in the way that people sometimes mean when they call a child difficult. She wasn't cruel or destructive or disobedient in any serious way. She was difficult in the way of a very intelligent person who has not found enough to occupy her intelligence, and who has been raised largely among adults, and therefore sometimes forgets to act like an 8-year-old. She had a tendency to correct people when she knew they were wrong, a complete inability to pretend to find something interesting when she found it boring, and a habit of asking questions that made her father and Mrs. Drummond look at each other over her head and wonder, separately, where she'd gotten the idea to ask things like that. Savannah didn't seem to find any of this particularly alarming. She taught Lily to braid her own hair, as promised, and then went further and taught her 3 other styles because Lily wanted to know them. She answered Lily's questions directly instead of deflecting them with the "ask your father" that Lily had learned meant the topic was uncomfortable. When Lily came back from school one afternoon in tears because a boy in her class had said something cutting about her dead mother, the kind of casual cruelty that children deploy without understanding the weight of it, Savannah didn't make sounds or offer comfort that required nothing. She sat with Lily on the porch steps and said, "What do you want to do about it?" Lily blinked. "What?" "When someone says something like that," Savannah said, "you can ignore them, or you can say something back, or you can let it hurt and cry, and that's all right too. What do you want to do?" Lily thought about it with her characteristic seriousness. "I want to say something back," she said, "but I don't know what." "All right, let's think about it. Let's think about..." They sat on the porch steps for the better part of an hour, coming up with possible responses, evaluating them, discarding some, and keeping others. By the time dinner was ready, Lily had a small arsenal of things she could say, and also seemed somehow lighter, as though the act of preparing for the thing had removed some of its power over her. Caleb had heard most of this from inside the house through the screen door, and he had stayed inside because it wasn't his conversation, and he knew better than to interrupt it. But he thought about it afterward. He thought about it more than was probably necessary. The whispers started about 6 weeks in. Red Mesa was 40 minutes' ride from the ranch, but gossip traveled faster than horses in this part of the territory, carried by anyone who passed through. The feed store delivery, the traveling medicine man, the women who came to the church circle from a 20-mile radius every second Sunday. Caleb heard the first version of it from Cody, who had gone into town for supplies and come back with a troubled expression and too much silence. "Something you want to tell me?" Caleb said, finding him in the equipment shed. Cody turned a wrench in his hands. "People are talking," he said. "About Miss Savannah. About why you brought her." Caleb waited. "They're saying you—" Cody stopped. Started again. "The story they've got is that you bought her from her father, that she's living out here as your—" He stopped again. His face had gone red. "They're not saying anything respectful." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What are you saying about it?" he said. Cody looked up quickly. "I'm telling them they're wrong," he said. "I've been here 6 weeks and I know exactly what's happening in this house. There's nothing—" He stopped. "I just thought you should know." "I appreciate it," Caleb said. He didn't tell Savannah, partly because he wasn't sure what good it would do, and partly because he suspected she already knew. She had a way of going still sometimes when something landed on her that she hadn't been expecting, and over the past week he'd noticed her doing that more. Brief moments of stillness that she covered quickly and didn't talk about. He found out she knew when he came into the kitchen late one evening and found her at the table with a cup of cold tea and the particular look of a person who has been sitting with something difficult for long enough that the tea went cold. "People talk," she said before he could ask. "They do. They think I'm your—" She looked at her hands. "I heard what they think." "I know. It doesn't bother you?" She looked up at him then, and there was something genuinely curious in it, not accusatory, just trying to understand him. "Your reputation—" "My reputation can handle it," Caleb said, pulling out the chair across from her. "People in this county have thought worse of me for less reason. It'll settle when they don't have anything new to say." Savannah looked at him for a long moment. "You really believe that?" "It's true. Most men would be—" She stopped, reconsidered whatever she'd been about to say. "Most men would care more about what people thought. Most men haven't been doing this long enough to know that people think what they want to and then move on to the next thing." He paused. "Does it bother you, what they're saying?" She was quiet for long enough that he knew it did. "I've been talked about before," she said finally. "I know how to survive it." "That's not the same as it not bothering you." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise or might have been recognition. That look people get when someone says a thing they've known but not expected to hear aloud. "No," she said, "it's not." She picked up her teacup, remembered it was cold, and set it back down. The kitchen was quiet around them, just the settling sounds of the house at night, the distant low of cattle from the direction of the field. "I'm not running, if that's what you're wondering," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know you're not," Caleb said. She looked at him again, a quick studying look, and then she stood and took her cup to the sink and said goodnight, and went to her room off the kitchen. And Caleb sat at the table in the quiet house for another few minutes before going to bed, turning over something in his mind that he didn't have precise language for yet, and deciding, in the practical, forward-facing way he made most decisions, that he didn't need to name it right now. There was work in the morning. There was always work in the morning.
"Oh?"
Victor Crane arrived in Red Mesa 2 weeks before Christmas, which everyone in the county noticed because Victor Crane's arrivals were not quiet affairs. He came with a wagon, a manservant, a canvas tent full of merchandise samples, and the particular air of a man who believed that any territory could be improved by his presence in it. He had money from the Eastern Rail Companies, a finger in 3 different land development schemes, and a smile so well practiced it had become impossible to tell whether anything behind it was genuine. He was 45, well-dressed by the standards of the frontier, and divorced in the way that rich men of a certain era were divorced, the wife in question having retreated to the east with a settlement and a silence that had been purchased rather than earned. Caleb knew him slightly, the way ranchers knew anyone who might want to buy or sell land in the territory. They'd had 2 or 3 civil conversations over the years, which was about as much warmth as either of them required. He ran into Crane at the feed store the first week of December, which was not unusual, and they talked briefly about cattle prices and the incoming winter, which was also not unusual. Crane mentioned he was in the area for several weeks, settling some business questions he hadn't been able to resolve from a distance. "Land?" Caleb asked.
Among other things, Crane said, pleasantly vague, he had a quality of pleasantness that was like a locked door with a cheerful mat in front of it. I hear you've expanded the double R. Some, Caleb said, and taken on some new household help. It was said in the exact tone of a man testing a fact he's already confirmed through other channels. Caleb kept his expression easy. Word gets around, he said. Small territory, Crane smiled. I may come by and see you. There are some matters I'd like to discuss. You're welcome any time, Caleb said, which was true in the way that most polite social lies are, technically accurate but carrying a second meaning. He didn't think much about it on the ride home. He had a gate that needed rehanging and a decision to make about a new bull before spring, and Victor Crane was a man he'd managed fine by keeping at arm's length for 10 years. He thought about it more after Crane rode out to the Double R 4 days later. He came in the late morning when Caleb was in the yard going over the spring planting schedule with Walt and Harlan. Crane rode up, tied his horse, and handed off the niceties with the efficiency of a man whose time was money. How was the winter? Fine weather. Remarkable spread you have here, Ryder. Then he looked toward the house in a way that was just barely too deliberate. I wonder if I might trouble you for a cup of coffee, he said, and I'd hope to speak to the young woman who's been working for you. Miss Reed, I believe? Caleb looked at him. I have a proposition that might interest her, Crane said. He said it mildly, the way he said most things, his tone preemptively brushing aside the question of whether this was appropriate. A business matter. What kind of business matter? Crane's smile stayed exactly where it was. I'd rather discuss it with her present, if you don't mind. It concerns her more than you. Caleb looked at Walt, who had gone very still in the way of a man who is listening carefully while pretending he isn't. He looked back at Crane. I'll ask her, he said. She can decide if she wants to talk to you. He went inside, found Savannah in the kitchen folding laundry, and told her flatly that Crane was outside and had asked to speak with her about something he'd called a business proposition. She set down the shirt she was holding. About what? I don't know. He wouldn't say. He paused. You don't have to talk to him. She thought about it for a moment. I'll hear what he has to say, she said. They came out to the porch, Caleb, Savannah, Crane, and by the accident of proximity, Cody, who happened to be working near the barn, and was suddenly finding that section of fence extremely interesting. Crane turned his most practiced smile on Savannah, and Savannah regarded him with the careful, neutral face she'd worn the first day Caleb met her, the face that gave away nothing. Miss Reed, Crane said, I've heard you're a woman of some considerable capability. The people of Red Mesa speak very highly of you. That's kind of them, Savannah said. I'll be direct, Crane said, and paused in a way that suggested directness was something he put on rather than something he was. I'm in the position of looking to establish a household of some permanence in this territory. I have considerable resources and the intention to build something substantial here. I'm looking for a wife. He let that land. I believe you might be an excellent candidate. I'm prepared to offer you a position of great security, a home, financial stability, social standing, in exchange for your hand. He smiled at her. And perhaps in exchange for your contract with Mr. Ryder, which I'm also prepared to purchase at a fair price. There was a silence. Savannah looked at him steadily, and Caleb, watching from where he stood at the edge of the porch, had the sense of watching someone he'd understood as cautious become, very quietly, something more than that. No, thank you, she said. Crane's smile adjusted itself. I don't think you've fully considered... I said no. Her voice was still even, still that careful quiet, but there was something different underneath it now. Not the controlled tension of someone trying not to make a scene, but the simpler, clearer quality of a woman who knows what she means. My contract isn't for sale, neither am I. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Crane, but I'm not interested in it. Crane looked at Caleb. The pleasantness in his face had developed a small, hard quality at the edges, the way lacquered wood develops cracks when the temperature changes. Perhaps you could speak to her, he said, as her employer. She gave you her answer, Caleb said. A beat. Crane looked between them. I see, he said, with the particular evenness of a man putting something on a shelf to be dealt with later. Well, thank you for your time. He put his hat on with a deliberate movement and walked to his horse and rode out without looking back.
Walt had apparently been needing to fix that section of fence very badly because he was still there. He said nothing. He just watched Crane ride away and then looked at Caleb and then went back to his fence with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to be absolutely neutral. Savannah had turned and gone back inside. Caleb stood on the porch in the cold December air and watched the dust from Crane's horse settle on the road and felt a thing he could not precisely name, something between relief and something else, something that was going to take him some time to look at directly. He went inside. There was work in the morning. There was always work in the morning. But the work, from that point on, carried something in it that it hadn't carried before, a weight of attention, a quality of noticing. He noticed the way Savannah moved through the house like she'd come to belong in it, not the tentative borrowed presence of a new hire, but the ease of someone who has decided quietly that a place is hers. He noticed the way Lily gravitated toward her, the way the 8-year-old who had always held herself a little apart had started bringing her questions and her problems, and occasionally her half-finished drawings to the woman who sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and made room for her without comment. He noticed that when he came in from a long day and Savannah was in the kitchen and she looked up and said something ordinary, asked about the cattle, mentioned a repair that needed doing, told him Lily had done something remarkable or infuriating at school, the particular quality of coming home felt different than it had for the 4 years since his wife had died. He noticed all of this. He filed it in the same internal shelf where he kept things that required more careful thinking before he was ready to do anything about them. December moved towards Christmas with the slow ratcheting cold of a high desert winter, and the double R settled into its holiday rhythms. Mrs. Drummond's extra baking, Lily's mounting excitement, the hands putting together the small gestures of celebration that working men far from family cobble together every year on ranches across the territory. And under all of it, like a base runner waiting on a signal, the business that Victor Crane had called a proposition and Savannah had called no, which had not ended the way Crane intended, and which, though no one on the double R knew it yet, was nowhere near finished. The new year came in cold and without ceremony. January on the Mesa was a month that demanded nothing romantic from the people living through it. No sentiment, no reflection, just the daily arithmetic of survival. Keep the animals fed, keep the pipes from freezing, keep the firewood stacked higher than you think you'll need it. The double R ran on a stripped-down winter schedule that meant longer hours in worse conditions for everyone, and the particular camaraderie that forms between people who are cold and tired together and choose not to complain about it. Savannah had been on the ranch for nearly 3 months by the time January settled in, and whatever trial period might have existed in anyone's mind, hers, Caleb's, the Hands, Mrs. Drummond's, had quietly passed without anyone formally declaring it over. She was simply there. The way the kitchen table was there, the way the morning coffee was there, a thing the household had organized itself around without any meeting being called to decide it. She'd stopped flinching at unexpected sounds around the 6-week mark. Caleb had noticed it the way he noticed most things about her. Obliquely, without making it a point of observation, cataloging it privately and moving on. Before that, any quick movement near her, any voice raised above conversational level, had produced a very small but unmistakable physical response. A slight drawing inward, a shift of weight, the body making itself less of a target before the mind had time to assess whether that was necessary. He'd instructed the Hands, without explaining why, to knock before entering any room she might be in and to keep their volume down in the house. None of them had asked for a reason. By January, she walked through the house like a person who expected to be treated ordinarily, which was both a small thing and not a small thing at all. She and Lily had settled into a routine that had the comfortable shape of something that had been going on much longer than 3 months. Mornings, Savannah braided Lily's hair while Lily ate breakfast and talked, which Lily always did at length and with commitment. Afternoons, when Lily came back from the schoolhouse, there was a period of approximately 20 minutes during which Lily deposited the entire contents of her day. Everything that had happened, everything someone had said, everything that was unfair or interesting or confusing, into whatever room Savannah happened to be working in, and Savannah listened and responded with the particular quality of attention that Lily, who was smart enough to tell the difference, had decided was real. It was during one of these afternoon sessions, on a Tuesday in the second week of January, that Lily mentioned Victor Crane. Mabel Hutchins says her father thinks Mr. Crane is going to buy the Alderman property, Lily said, sitting on the kitchen counter in a position Mrs. Drummond had banned and Savannah had not yet gotten around to enforcing. The big one, east of town. Mabel says her father says Mr. Crane has enough money to buy half the county if he wanted. Savannah was rolling out biscuit dough. She didn't look up. Mabel's father probably knows more about it than I do. Mabel says her father says... Lily stopped. Actually, Mabel says a lot of things her father says. I wonder if Mabel has her own opinions. She's 8, Savannah said. Give her time. I'm 8. You have opinions enough for both of you, and then some. Lily appeared to take this as a compliment, which was probably the correct reading. She swung her feet against the cabinet. Do you think Mr. Crane is going to come back here? Savannah pressed a biscuit cutter into the dough. What makes you ask that? Because he looked like someone who doesn't like not getting what he wants, Lily said, with the frankness of a child who has not learned to soften observations. When he rode away, I was watching from the upstairs window, and he looked, she searched for the word, organized, like he was already thinking about the next thing. Savannah set down the cutter. She looked at Lily with an expression Caleb might have recognized, that brief pause before speaking that meant she was deciding how honest to be. You're probably right, she said. Are you scared of him? No, Savannah said. Then, because Lily had the kind of ears that could hear the difference between a true no and a performing one. Not of him exactly, of what someone like him can do when they decide they're owed something. Lily absorbed this quietly. Then she said, Papa won't let anything happen to you. I know that, Savannah said. He's very... Lily made a gesture with both hands that was apparently meant to convey something comprehensive. He's not always easy to talk to, but he's the kind of person who does what he says. I know that too, Savannah said, and she went back to her biscuits with an expression that was not quite neutral and not quite anything else that could be named simply. What Lily had said about Crane looking organized proved to be more accurate than either of them could have predicted. He appeared in Red Mesa in mid-January with purpose and resources, and the particular energy of a man operating on a timeline he hadn't shared with anyone. He bought the Alderman property, 1,200 acres east of town, significantly more land than any single man needed for anything other than leverage. He set up an office in the building that had previously been used as a land surveyor's workspace and hired 2 men from out of county to staff it. He hosted a dinner at the saloon for half a dozen of the area's significant landowners and merchants. A dinner that was described by those who attended as very pleasant and about which details were remarkably sparse in the retelling. Caleb heard about most of this through Walt, who had a cousin in town, and through the feed store owner who had a gift for synthesizing everything he heard across his counter into a coherent picture of local activity. He heard about the dinner specifically from the county land registrar, a careful man named Jessup, who had attended and come away with the specific mild discomfort of a man who has eaten well and listened politely and is not entirely sure what he's been recruited into. He's buying up access rights, Jessup told Caleb over coffee in his small office in Red Mesa. Quietly, water rights, grazing easements, the road corridor along the eastern edge of the mesa. Nothing illegal, just strategic. Strategic toward what? Caleb said. Jessup turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was a careful man by profession and by nature, and he took his time. The railroad's been talking about a spur line through this county for 3 years, he said. If it comes through, the property along the eastern corridor becomes the most valuable land in the territory. Anyone who controls the water rights and the road access in that area. He stopped. Controls the railroad's options, Caleb said. And anyone who might want to expand in the east direction, Jessup said. Caleb looked at him. My eastern boundary. Jessup looked at his coffee. I'm not telling you anything official, he said. I'm just telling you what I see. Caleb rode home thinking about easements and spur lines and Victor Crane's particular quality of pleasantness, and thinking also about a woman who had said no to that pleasantness without flinching, and about what it meant when men like Crane said they were interested in something, and then kept maneuvering after being told that interest wasn't welcome. He didn't sleep especially well that night. Crane came back to the Double R on a Saturday afternoon in late January, and this time he brought a different kind of visit. Not a social call, not a veiled proposition, but something dressed in the language of business that had the structure of a threat if you read it right. He came alone, which was polite, and he asked for Caleb, not Savannah, which was also polite. And the three of them ended up on the porch in the winter cold because Caleb had no intention of inviting him past the door, and Crane had apparently decided not to object to that. Savannah had come out because she'd been in the front room when Crane arrived, and there'd been no graceful way to absent herself, and because Caleb suspected she hadn't wanted to. She sat in the porch chair to Caleb's left with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged in the same careful neutral it always wore for Crane. Crane's proposition, delivered with the brisk warmth of a man who considers himself good at this, was simple. He wanted to purchase the eastern 40 acres of the Double R, along with the associated grazing rights and the road easement that ran along the property's boundary. He offered a price that was fair by standard measures, perhaps a few % above market. Not interested, Caleb said. I haven't. Crane smiled. I haven't laid out the full terms yet.
I don't need the full terms. That land sits between my water source and my east fields. I don't sell land that I can't replace the function of. Crane nodded slowly, like a man receiving information he'd already accounted for. I understand your hesitation, he said. Let me add that I'm prepared to offer you a continued easement access, properly documented, for a period of Caleb kept his voice level. I said no. I'm not going to get to yes by hearing more of it. A pause. Crane looked at Savannah, which Caleb noticed and did not like. You've built something good here, Crane said, still addressing Caleb, but with the quality of a man who is demonstrating his peripheral vision. A working ranch, a household. You've clearly got an eye for investments. The word was measured and left just enough space around it to mean more than one thing. I respect that. I just wonder whether, given certain realities of the territory, it makes sense to position yourself against someone who's going to be a significant presence in this county for the foreseeable future. There's a way of doing this that works for everyone. There's a way of doing this where I keep my land and you find a different route for whatever you're building, Caleb said. That works for me. Crane looked at him for a moment. The pleasant surface was entirely intact, but underneath it something had shifted, a very small recalibration. Well, he said, I appreciate your directness. You're welcome to come back when you're not asking for something I've already declined, Caleb said. Until then, I've got work. Crane stood, put on his hat. He looked at Savannah one more time, not the obvious looking of a man asserting ownership, but something more indirect and therefore harder to object to. Miss Reed, he said, I hope the winter's treating you well. Fine, thank you, Savannah said. He rode away. The dust settled. The cold came back in off the mesa where it had been waiting. He's not done, Savannah said quietly. No, Caleb said. He's not. She was quiet for a moment, then, what does he actually want, the land or, both, Caleb said. Maybe the land more. The other thing because he doesn't like being told no. He stood. He'll try something different next time. They always do. They, she said, with a flatness that told him she knew exactly the category of men he meant, had known it long before Victor Crane arrived in this county. Come inside, he said. It's cold. She stood and followed him in, and Mrs. Drummond, who had been very busy with something in the kitchen that kept her near the window with a clear line of sight to the porch, turned back to her stove with the expression of a woman who has seen enough and formed her opinion and will keep it until asked. February came, and with it a loosening. Not warmth exactly, but the first faint suggestion that the cold was finite, that somewhere in the biology of the land something was beginning to stir. The days got longer by measurable increments. The cattle moved differently. Even the horses seemed to have an opinion about it. Savannah had taken on, in the last weeks, the additional responsibility of the household accounts, which had been kept by Caleb in a ledger that was accurate but not well organized, a record of what had been spent but not a tool for understanding patterns. She had asked, tentatively, if she might look it over. She'd kept her father's accounts before she understood why that was a cruel joke, a woman maintaining the financial records of a man who saw her as part of the inventory. Caleb had handed her the ledger without conditions, and she had spent 3 evenings reorganizing it into something that actually said something useful. She brought it to him one evening in the front room, where he was working through correspondence, and laid it on the desk with a column she'd added that she hadn't been asked for, a comparison between what the ranch was spending on feed versus what it was producing per head,
adjusted for the winter reduction. You're overpaying for the Eastern supplier, she said, without preamble. There's a mill in Prescott that charges less per hundredweight and has better quality, according to the Hartley Ranch. I asked Mrs. Drummond, and she said Walt mentioned them once. If you switched, you'd save about $60 over the course of the year. Caleb looked at the numbers. They were right. He looked up at her. I've been using Jensen because I've been using Jensen for 10 years, he said. I know, he's still got better prices on hardware. She pointed to another column. I'd keep that relationship, just not the feed. He looked at the work she'd put into it. The clean columns, the added comparisons, the way she'd preserved the original structure while adding a layer that made it actually useful. This is good, he said. I can keep doing it, she said, monthly, if you want. I want, he said. She took the ledger back, but she didn't leave immediately. She stood at the edge of his desk with the ledger in her arms, and a quality of wanting to say something that she was deciding whether to say. What? He said. I've been thinking about Crane, she said. That makes two of us. He's not going to give up on the land just because you said no. She set the ledger down and pulled the other chair up without being asked, something she wouldn't have done in October, and the fact that she did it now without thinking said something that Caleb noted quietly. I think he's going to try to make things difficult for you. Not directly. He's not that kind. He'll do it through the county, though. The land office, the water rights board, whatever pressure points he can reach. Probably, Caleb said. Then you need to be in front of it. She looked at him steadily. The water rights on your eastern boundary. Do you have them properly documented? Not just the original land grant, but the current county records? He thought about it. The original grant, yes. County records. He paused. I had a survey done 6 years ago. Whether it's registered with the current board, I'm not certain. Then you should be certain, she said, before Crane's people are. Caleb looked at her. In the lamplight, with the ledger on the desk between them and the easy directness of someone who had decided to stop waiting for permission to be useful, she looked entirely different than the woman who had stood beside her father's table in the dusty flats, with her hands folded and her eyes on the floor. The shape of her face was the same. Something behind the eyes was not. When did you start thinking this way? He said. She seemed slightly surprised by the question. What do you mean? Strategically. The accounts, the land records? He wasn't sure how to say it without sounding like he was underestimating what she'd been before. You've been thinking about the ranch's vulnerabilities. She was quiet for a moment. I've always thought this way, she said. I just never had anything that was worth protecting before. The room was quiet. The fire had burned down some. Caleb said, I'll go to the county office next week. I'll come with you, she said. If that's all right. I know how land records are organized. I used to help the county clerk in Red Mesa when I was younger, before... She stopped. I know how to find things in those files. All right, he said. She picked up the ledger and said goodnight and went to her room, and Caleb sat in the front room with the lamp burning and thought about what she'd said. I never had anything worth protecting before, and felt the weight of that settle somewhere in his chest and stay there. Tut. They went to the county office in Prescott on a Thursday, which was a full day's ride. Caleb brought Walt along for the company on the road, and because Walt had a gift for being useful in situations where extra hands were required, and Savannah rode Opal in the kind of easy silence that had become their default on long stretches, comfortable in a way that neither of them had decided to make comfortable, it had just arrived that way. The county records office was staffed by a young man named Perch, who had the look of someone who had expected his clerical career to involve less actual work than it did, and who responded to Savannah's specific and organized questions about the Eastern Water Rights registration with the slightly pained efficiency of a person who could see he was dealing with someone who actually knew what she was asking about. She found the gap in 40 minutes. It was not a large gap, and not an intentional one. A registration that had been filed with the original land office before the county reorganized its record-keeping structure, and which had not been transferred to the new system when the reorganization happened. Not invalid, just invisible in the current index. If someone were searching the current county records for competing claims on that water corridor, they wouldn't see Caleb's standing registration. They'd see an apparent vacancy. This needs to be refiled under the current structure, Savannah told Perch, with a tone that was not unkind but also was not asking. Today, if possible.
The original documentation is here. She laid out the papers she'd brought, and it predates any other claim on that corridor by 11 years. Perch looked at the papers, looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "Whatever she needs, whatever."
It took 2 hours and required Perch's supervisor, a tired woman named Aldred, who had been doing county land administration for 20 years, and who looked at Savannah's organized documentation with the slow nod of someone recognizing competent work when it appears. By the time they were done, Caleb's water rights were properly indexed in the current system, stamped, witnessed, and as protected from challenge as 11-year-old documentation could be. They ate lunch at a decent place near the courthouse. Not a celebration exactly, but the kind of meal that follows a morning of hard, effective work, and which tastes better than its ingredients would suggest. "If he'd filed a competing claim before we did this," Caleb said, "how bad would it have been?" Savannah tore off a piece of bread. "Bad. Not unsurvivable, but months of legal dispute, and in the meantime you'd have had to operate carefully. Could have affected your spring planting if it dragged on." She paused. "He may already know about the gap. Someone who did a thorough search of the current index would have found it. So we may have beaten him." "May have." She looked at her plate. "He'll find another angle." "He always does," Walt observed from the other end of the table, which was the longest sentence Walt had contributed to the entire day, and which Caleb and Savannah both acknowledged by not responding to it, which was the appropriate tribute to a Walt Greer observation. Os. They were right. Crane found another angle. In the first week of March, Denton Reed appeared in Red Mesa after what seemed to have been an extended absence from the area. He was slightly less disheveled than the last time anyone had seen him, which suggested he'd had access to money recently, which was interesting given that Reed had not been known for the last several years to have access to money. He drank at the Dusty Flats and talked to people, in the particular way of a man who has been sent to talk to people. Not circulating naturally, but visiting specific individuals, having specific conversations, with the quality of someone working from a list. Caleb heard about this from Cody, who had gone to town for supplies and run into 2 different people who mentioned it independently. He thought about whether to tell Savannah. He thought about it for about half a day, which was longer than he usually spent on decisions, but which was justified by the particular quality of the decision. Whether to hand someone a piece of information that would hurt them and that they might, in some reasonable argument, be better off not having. He told her that evening. She was in the kitchen, sitting at the table after dinner with a cup of tea she was actually drinking this time. He sat down across from her and said, "Your father's back in Red Mesa." She went very still. "Cody saw him," Caleb said. "He's been talking to people. I don't know yet exactly what he's saying, but the people he's visiting aren't random." She looked at the cup in her hands. Something moved across her face that was hard to categorize. Not fear, not quite grief, more like the specific weariness of a person who had hoped a particular chapter was finished and is being shown it isn't. "Crane," she said. "That's my guess." "He'd know that my father would do just about anything for a bottle and some cash," she said, with the flat clarity of someone who has long since run out of softening language for a hard fact. "What's he trying to do with him? Get him to say something about me, make trouble for you, or—" "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "I'm trying to find out." She nodded slowly. She looked at the table surface for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked up. "For what?" "That he's your father, and he's doing this." Her expression shifted in a way he couldn't fully read. Not the shuttered neutrality she'd had in the beginning, but something more complicated. Like a room where several things are happening at once, and the light is dim enough that you can't be sure of all of them. "He's been doing one version or another of this my whole life," she said. "He doesn't get to keep being the thing that breaks me." She said it quietly and with certainty. Not as a performance of strength, but as a plain statement of fact. "What do I need to do?" "Right now, nothing," Caleb said. "Let me find out what he's actually saying before we decide how to respond to it." "All right." She picked up her cup. "Thank you for telling me." "I wasn't sure if I should." "You should always tell me," she said. "I'd rather know." He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the lamplight, with the winter cold pressing against the windows, and the house quiet around them, and something settled into place in his understanding of her that had been assembling itself for months. The way she was built, the grain of her, what she was made of under all the things she'd had to survive to get to this kitchen table. It wasn't a soft thing. It wasn't supposed to be. "Savannah," he said, and then stopped because he wasn't sure what he'd meant to say after that. Her name, maybe. Just that. She looked at him. "Nothing," he said. "Good night." "Good night, Caleb." He went upstairs. He did not sleep especially well, but this time it had less to do with Victor Crane and land records and more to do with the quality of the silence that had existed in the kitchen after he'd said her name. March moved through its weeks with the grudging yielding of a territory that doesn't let go of winter easily. The days were getting warmer, but the nights held the cold like they had a personal stake in it, and the ranch crew worked the long middle hours between freeze and thaw with the efficiency of people who've learned not to waste the functional parts of the day. Savannah had started joining the morning briefings. It had happened gradually, without a formal invitation. She would be in the yard when Caleb gathered the hands for the day's assignments, and after the first few times she'd lingered on the edge of the group, he'd started including her in the conversation as a matter of course, asking what the kitchen needed in terms of timing, whether the household had particular requirements that should factor into the day's plan. And she had started offering things he hadn't asked for. Observations about the cattle she'd noticed from the kitchen window, a question about a section of fence she'd walked past that didn't look right, information she'd gathered from Mrs. Drummond about what the neighboring ranches were doing with their spring planting. Walt had said nothing about this. Walt said nothing about most things, but his particular quality of saying nothing about this had the character of approval. Harlan, who was older and had more opinions, had made one comment in Cody's hearing about women who didn't know their place, which Cody had relayed to Savannah with the transparent intention of gauging her response. She had said, "Tell Harlan that if he can do the accounts and manage the kitchen and tell you all what each of you needs to hear before you know you need to hear it, I'll gladly let him have his place." And Cody had delivered this message with poorly concealed enjoyment, and Harlan had subsequently said nothing further about the subject. It was during one of these morning briefings on a Thursday in the third week of March that Caleb told them Crane had formally applied to the Water Rights Board for a review of the Eastern Corridor access. Not a competing claim exactly, but a challenge to the historical documentation, arguing that the original survey predated current standards and should be reevaluated. The hands received this with the quiet gravity of people who understand what water means on a working ranch. "He's been told the documentation is solid," Caleb said. Jessup confirmed it, but a formal review can take time, and in the meantime, it creates uncertainty. He looked around the group. "I need to know if anyone's been approached by Crane's people, directly or indirectly. If he's trying to get witnesses or testimony about the ranch's historical water use, I want to know." No one said anything. Then Cody raised his hand slightly, which was a very Cody gesture. "A man came by the feed store last week when I was in town," he said. "Asked me questions, said he was doing a survey for the county. Asked about how long I'd worked here, what the water situation was like on the East Fields." He paused. "I didn't know if I should have said anything." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing useful," Cody said. "Said I didn't handle the water side of things, which is true, but I didn't know if I should have told him to go away." "If it happens again," Caleb said, "you don't answer anything. You say you need to speak to me first. That goes for all of you." They nodded. Savannah was standing at the edge of the group, and she was looking at something in the middle distance with an expression Caleb had come to recognize as her thinking face. After the briefing broke up, she stayed. "He's building a record," she said when the others were out of earshot. "Yes, which means he's planning to use the review as the opening move, not the main one." She squinted at the East Fields, just visible past the barn. "He wants to tie you up in the review long enough to file something else, an adjacent claim, a grazing dispute, something that benefits from your attention being elsewhere." She looked at him. "Is there anyone on the Water Rights Board who owes him something?" Caleb thought about it. "Possibly. Board member named Cassidy has been friendly with Crane's business interests. I've heard rumors about their arrangement, but I can't prove anything." "Then you need someone on the board who owes you something," she said, "or someone whose judgment is unimpeachable. The review process has a public comment period. I read the board charter last week." She said this without apparent awareness of how unusual it was to have read the Water Rights Board charter for recreational purposes. "If you submit documentation and supporting testimony during the comment period, A sympathetic board member can extend the record-gathering phase, buys you time, and creates a more complete record in your favor. But Caleb looked at her for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Do you know how unusual you are?" She blinked. Something shifted in her expression. Not pleased exactly, more like startled, the way a person looks when they've been expecting a criticism and received something else entirely. "I just pay attention," she said. "Most people pay attention to different things." She looked away. The east fields were pale gold in the morning light, and the sky above the mesa was the particular clear blue of a high desert March morning, the kind of blue that seemed to promise something without quite specifying what. "Who can you trust on the board?" she said, returning to practical ground the way she always did when a conversation started to move towards something harder to navigate. "Jessup can give me names," he said. "I'll write out this week. I'll draft a summary of the documentation," she said, "for the public comment record, in case you need it." "All right." She nodded and went back inside, and Caleb stood in the yard for a moment longer, looking at the east fields and the blue sky and the particular shape the morning had taken, and feeling something that had been gathering for months settle into a form he was almost ready to name. Spring came, and with it a slow shift in the quality of the ranch's days. The work expanded back out from its winter contractions, the crew larger by 2 hands hired for the busy season, the fields coming alive in the specific stubborn way of high desert growth, not lush, not romantic, but persistent in a manner that suggested it had been doing this long before anyone was watching and would keep doing it long after. Savannah was still there. He thought about that sometimes, in the uncomplicated way you think about things that are simply true. She was still there, and the woman who was still there bore some resemblance to the woman who had signed a work contract at this kitchen table in November, but was not entirely the same person. She held herself differently. She spoke first, now, instead of waiting to be spoken to. She'd made 3 friends in town: the schoolteacher, a woman named Clara who ran the dry goods store, and improbably the county land registrar's wife, who had come out to the Double R for a visit in February and left 3 hours later, having apparently decided Savannah was someone worth knowing. She'd started having opinions about the ranch. Not just the household accounts, though the accounts were now a model of organization that had saved Caleb money in 2 separate categories, but the operation itself. Questions about the cattle rotation, observations about the fencing pattern on the south pasture, a suggestion about the spring planting schedule that Walt had listened to with his characteristic silence, and then, 2 days later, implemented without comment. It was Walt who said something about it, which surprised Caleb, because Walt did not typically say things. He found Caleb in the equipment shed in the first week of April, and stood in the doorway for a moment in the way of a man deciding whether to commit to a conversation, and then said, "She's good for this place." Caleb looked up from the gear he was sorting. "I know." Walt nodded. He appeared to be working up to something with the effort of a man who has used up most of his word allotment for the year. "And she's good for you," he said. Caleb went still. "Not saying anything else about it," Walt added quickly. "Just saying what's there." He turned and went back out into the yard. Caleb stayed in the equipment shed for a moment, looking at the gear in his hands, and then set it down carefully and went back to what he'd been doing, which was harder to concentrate on than it usually was. The problem, if it was a problem, was that Walt was not wrong, had not been wrong. And Caleb was an honest enough man, in the privacy of his own understanding, to have known it for a while. She was there at the kitchen table in the mornings and the evenings, and sometimes in the middle of a working day when she came out to the yard with water, or a question, or a piece of information he needed. She was there in the way Lily talked about her, with a matter-of-fact warmth that told him his daughter had made a decision about this person that did not admit of revision. She was there in the gap her absence would leave if she chose, someday, to go, a gap that had gotten wider and less manageable looking the longer he thought about it. He had not said any of this. He was not sure he had the right to. The contract between them was a work contract, and she had come to it under circumstances that had given her very little room to refuse. And however freely she seemed to inhabit this place now, however clearly she had made her own choices within it, there was a question of whether the foundation of the thing allowed him to introduce a different kind of wanting into it without contaminating the freedom she'd found. He thought about this with the careful discipline of a man who has learned that some decisions, made too quickly, cannot be unmade. And in the meantime, there was the water rights review, and Crane's maneuvering and a ranch to run and a daughter to raise, which was enough to occupy a person. But it was there. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even to himself. The April night when the fire started, none of them were ready for it. The fire started a little past 2 in the morning. Caleb woke to the smell before he heard anything. Smoke, the particular dense kind that carries heat in it. Not the thin wood stove smell of an ordinary night, but something heavier, something that pulled him upright before his mind had finished assembling itself. He was at the window in 4 steps, and he saw the orange light moving against the dark of the yard, and his stomach dropped completely. The barn. He was pulling on his boots and shouting down the hall before he'd made any conscious decision to do either. He heard Walt stir in the room at the end of the passage. Walt had taken to sleeping in the house rather than the bunkhouse in the colder months, an arrangement nobody had formally discussed, but that had simply settled into place. And he heard Savannah's door open almost simultaneously, which told him she'd been sleeping lightly or not at all. "Barn," he said, passing her doorway. "Get Lily and keep her inside." She didn't answer. He heard her moving fast. He went out through the kitchen and across the yard at a run, and the heat hit him 30 feet from the barn wall. Not the heat of a fire that has just started, but the heat of a fire that has been burning for some time already, which meant it had been set to burn before anyone woke up to notice it. He understood that in a cold mechanical part of his mind, while the rest of him was already calculating what was inside, what could still be saved, where the horses were. The horses were in the east stalls, which were the farthest from where the fire had started, the west side near the hay storage, which was precisely where anyone who wanted maximum damage would choose to begin. 3 of the horses were screaming. He could hear them from the yard, that particular animal panic that goes through a person at a frequency below sound. Cody was already at the water pump, working the handle with both arms in a rhythm that was fast, but not fast enough. Had never been fast enough against a fire this size. Harlan came out of the bunkhouse at a run. Walt was 2 steps behind Caleb, carrying the long-handled bucket that lived on the kitchen porch, which told Caleb that Walt had processed the situation in approximately the same amount of time and reached the same conclusions. "Horses first," Caleb said. They got the horses out through the east door, which had not yet caught. 4 horses total, all of them wild-eyed and requiring 2 men each to move without getting kicked. The 5th horse, a young gelding kept in the west end, was already gone. Caleb knew it before he reached that section, and he did not let himself stop moving. You stopped moving, the rest of it went too. The next 40 minutes were the kind of time that doesn't organize itself into a narrative while you're inside it. Just a sequence of immediate problems, each one replacing the last, smoke in your lungs and heat on your face, and the constant assessment of what mattered more than what. The fire took the west half of the barn and the hay storage completely. The east structure held because Harlan had gotten water on the connecting wall early enough, and because the wind that night was moving south rather than east, which was luck, and Caleb was aware it was luck even as he was grateful for it. By the time the fire had burned itself down to a manageable ruin, the sky was going gray with early morning. The 5 of them stood in the yard. Caleb, Walt, Harlan, Cody, and a young hand named Pete who'd come running from the bunkhouse once the shouting reached him, and looked at what was left. The east structure stood. The tack room was intact. The hay was gone, along with the west wall, the loft, and somewhere in there the young gelding who'd had no chance. Caleb stood with his coat charred at one elbow and his face blackened with smoke and ash in his hair, and he looked at the ruin of half a structure he'd built with his own hands 12 years ago, and he breathed. Then he turned around. Savannah was on the porch steps, and Lily was beside her, and Lily was asleep against Savannah's arm in the specific way of a child who had woken in terror and then been talked back down to safety, her cheek pressed against Savannah's shoulder, and her eyes closed, still in her nightgown with a blanket pulled around her. Savannah was watching him across the yard with both arms around the sleeping child, and her face showing the plainly visible remnants of the last 40 minutes. Fear held down through force of will, the particular exhaustion of someone who could not help and had to watch anyway. He walked across the yard to the steps. She looked at him for a moment, taking inventory the way you look at someone after something close and bad, checking for what's damaged, what's still there.
The horses? She said quietly, so as not to wake Lily. 4 out, he said. Lost the gelding. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. The structure? East section standing, west half's gone. He sat down on the step below where she was sitting, his elbows on his knees. The smoke smell was on everything, his clothes, his hands, the air itself. We were lucky with the wind. I know, she said. She'd been watching. She'd known every minute what the wind was doing. Caleb, she said it quietly in a way that meant she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. The way it started, the west wall, near the hay, someone who knew what they were doing would, I know, he said. A silence. We can't prove it yet, he said. No, she agreed. But we both know. He looked at the smoldering ruin of the west wall and thought about Victor Crane riding away from the double R with that small, hard adjustment behind his pleasant expression, and about Denton Reed appearing in Red Mesa with money and purpose after years of neither, and about the water rights review and the Eastern Corridor and the particular patience of men who are accustomed to achieving what they want through indirect means. Get some sleep, he said. Both of you. Lily won't wake up easily, Savannah said. She's completely gone. Carry her in. I'll stay out here a while. Savannah stood carefully, shifting Lily's weight without waking her. The girl was small enough still to be carried, though she was at an age where she'd have strong opinions about that fact in daylight. Savannah got her up the steps and through the door, and Caleb heard them inside. A murmur, the creak of Lily's bed. And then the house was quiet again, and he sat on the porch steps in the gray pre-dawn and smelled the smoke and listened to what it was telling him. The county sheriff came out 2 days later. His name was Briggs, a man in his mid-50s with the weathered, careful face of someone who had been doing this long enough to have seen the ways people covered things up and also the ways they failed to. He walked the burned section with Caleb and Walt, asked questions without committing to conclusions, and took notes in a small book he kept in his breast pocket. What I can tell you, Briggs said, standing at the edge of the fire damage, is that the point of origin is consistent with accelerant use. Whether that's negligence or intention is harder to say at this point. Someone left an accelerant against the hay wall of a working barn, and it's hard to say if it was intentional, Walt said. It was by some distance the most words Walt had spoken to the sheriff, and possibly to anyone outside the double R in a year. Briggs looked at him. What I mean is I can't tell you who without more, Briggs said, with the patience of a man who has explained legal standards before. You got anyone specific in mind? Victor Crane, Caleb said. He's been pressuring me to sell my eastern boundary and I've declined. He's had dealings with a man named Denton Reed who has reason to want to make trouble for this ranch. Briggs wrote something down. Crane's a significant property owner in this county now, he said, which was not a statement of opinion, but was also not nothing. I know what he is, Caleb said. Briggs looked at him. I'll make inquiries, he said. That's what I can offer you right now. If I find something solid, I'll be back. He rode out, and Caleb watched him go with the particular frustration of a man who has done everything through proper channels and is being told that proper channels take time. He was still standing in the yard when Savannah came out of the house. She had a mug of coffee, and she handed it to him without comment, which was the kind of gesture that had become ordinary between them over the months. The small economies of a shared life, the things done without requiring acknowledgement. What did he say? She asked. He'll make inquiries. She made a sound that was not quite a word. I know, he said. She stood beside him, and they both looked at the ruined west wall for a moment. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of April day that hadn't decided yet which season it wanted to be. My father was in Red Mesa 2 nights before the fire, she said. I heard from Clara yesterday. Caleb looked at her. I didn't know before, she said. Before it happened. Clara only told me because she thought I'd want to know after. She kept her eyes on the barn wall. I don't know if he was involved. I don't have a reason to think he wouldn't be, but I don't know for certain. You don't have to carry that, he said. I'm not carrying it, she said, in a tone that suggested she was in fact carrying it, had been since Clara told her, but had not yet decided how much weight to assign it. I'm just telling you what I know. She looked at him then. Because you should always know. He remembered saying that to her, months ago at the kitchen table.
He hadn't expected it to become a principle she'd kept. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She started to go back inside, then stopped. "The crew," she said. They don't know how to be right now. This morning Cody was going through the motions and he looked like someone put his fire out. They need something to move toward." "I know. So tell them. Tell them what we're doing about it. Not just the barn repairs. What we're doing about Crane, about the water review. All of it. They've earned knowing." She paused. "They'll work harder for a fight they understand than for a problem they're just watching." He thought about that. She was right in the particular way she was often right, which was the way of someone who has spent a long time observing how people work before having the standing to say anything about it. "I'll talk to them tonight," he said. He did. He gathered the crew at the kitchen table after dinner. All 6 of them, plus Savannah and Mrs. Drummond. Because Savannah had said they'd earned knowing, and he'd decided she was right. He told them about Crane's land campaign, about the water rights review, about Denton Reed's reappearance and what he suspected it meant. He told them about Briggs and the inquiry and what he realistically expected from it. He did not dress any of it up. When he was done, the table was quiet for a moment. Then Harlan, who had exactly one opinion about things and usually kept it simple, said, "So what do you need us to do?" Caleb looked at him. "Same thing you've been doing," he said, "just with your eyes open." Harlan nodded. That was apparently sufficient. Cody, who had been listening with his jaw slightly tight, said, "The gelding. Crane's people killed a horse." "Probably," Caleb said. "Then I don't want any of their money," Cody said, with the absolute conviction of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned to qualify his moral positions. "I don't care what they offer. Anyone approaches me again, I'll tell you same day." Walt said nothing, but the quality of his nothing was approving. Savannah, sitting at the end of the table, caught Caleb's eye and gave him a look that was almost too small to see, barely a shift in expression, the suggestion of a nod. And he understood it as, there. That's what they needed. The water rights review hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of April, and in the 2 weeks between the fire and the hearing, the Double R operated on a kind of heightened attention that was not quite fear and not quite readiness, but lived somewhere between the two. Repairs to the barn's east structure went forward with a speed made possible by every hand pulling extra hours, and by 3 neighbors who showed up on a Saturday with tools and labor and the particular frontier solidarity of people who understand that what happens to one working ranch in a county is a message to all of them. Clara from the dry goods store came with her husband. The schoolteacher, Miss Adler, came and spent the day helping Savannah feed 20 people from the ranch kitchen. A rancher named Fowler, who ran land 4 miles east of the Double R and had had his own run-ins with Crane's expansion interests, brought 2 of his hands and stayed until the light was gone. Savannah moved through all of it with a quality that Caleb had not seen in her before. Not the careful, reserved competence of the early months, but something more open. The ease of a woman operating in a community she had made rather than one she'd been assigned to. She knew everyone by name. She knew which neighbor's wife had been sick and asked about her. She knew Fowler's oldest son had gotten into a disagreement with the county school board, and she asked about that too. And Fowler looked at her with the particular surprise of a man unused to being remembered as a person rather than a property owner. "Where'd you find her?" Fowler asked Caleb, low, when they were both standing back watching the work in the afternoon. "Red Mesa," Caleb said. Fowler looked at Savannah for another moment. "You're lucky," he said. "I know," Caleb said. The barn repair didn't finish that day. It took another week of work from the Double R crew before the east structure was sound, and the beginnings of the west section were framed up enough to keep the elements out. But it moved forward, which was what mattered, and the crew moved with it in the way that people move toward a thing they've decided to fight for. The night before the water rights hearing, Caleb found Savannah at the kitchen table late, which was not unusual, with papers spread in front of her that he recognized as the documentation package she'd compiled for the public comment record. She'd been refining it for 2 weeks, cross-referencing the original survey against the current county maps, adding affidavits from 3 long-term area residents who could testify to the Double R's historical water use, attaching a timeline that made the sequence of registrations and Crane's recent maneuvering into something that even a board member inclined toward Crane would find difficult to dismiss. She looked up when he came in. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm almost done." He sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, just the sound of her pen moving and the night outside the windows and the house settling around them. "Savannah," he said. She looked up. He told himself he was going to wait. Wait until the hearing was done, until Crane was resolved, until the circumstances were cleaner and the timing was less complicated by everything that had been pressing on them for months. He'd made a reasonable argument to himself about why it was smarter to let things settle before saying something that couldn't be unsaid. "I'm not going to say this right," he said, "but I've been trying to find the right time for about 2 months, and I'm beginning to think there isn't one." She set down her pen.
"I don't know how to ask this without it sounding like what it's not," he said. "I know why you came here. I know what the contract was. And I know you've built something real in this place. For yourself, not because of me. And I don't want to put you in a position where you feel like—" He stopped. Started again, because he was circling and she deserved something more direct. "I care about you, more than is probably wise, given everything.
And I'd want to say that out loud regardless of what you do with it. I'm not asking for anything." The kitchen was very quiet. Savannah looked at him with that careful studying look she had, the one that went farther in than people expected. She was quiet for long enough that his stomach had time to do several things he'd rather it hadn't. "I know," she said finally. "You knew," he said. "For a while," she said. It wasn't said with satisfaction or with triumph, just with the honesty of a woman who has learned not to pretend she doesn't see what she sees. "I didn't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it." She looked at the papers in front of her, then she looked back at him. "I'm not ready," she said. "Not because I don't—" She stopped. "Because I need to know that anything between us starts from something I chose with my whole self, not from gratitude or obligation, or because I didn't have anywhere else to go." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the work it was taking. "I'm not there yet. I don't know exactly when I will be." "That's a fair answer," he said. "You're not—" She seemed to be searching for whether he was hurt by this, assessing his face with the focus of a person who has learned to read the gap between what people say and what they mean. "It's a fair answer," he said again, more simply. "I meant it when I said I wasn't asking for anything. I wanted you to know, that's all." She looked at him for another moment. Something in her expression was quieter than it had been at the beginning of the conversation. After the hearing, she said, "When some of this has settled—" She paused. "Let me think." "Take all the time you need," he said. She nodded once. She picked up her pen. He sat with her at the table for another half hour while she finished the documentation, and neither of them said anything else about it, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have put something fragile down carefully and are giving it room. He went to bed before she did. He slept better than he had in weeks. The water rights hearing was held in the county meeting hall in Prescott, a room that smelled of old wood and tobacco and the specific institutional stuffiness of any building where public business has been argued for a long time. The board was 5 members seated behind a long table at the front. Crane was there with 2 lawyers in suits that cost more than most men in the room, made in a month. Jessup was there, as was the sympathetic board member he'd quietly recommended, a woman named Holt, who had been on the water board for 7 years and whose opinion carried weight. Caleb had Savannah on one side of him and a lawyer named Garner, recommended by Jessup, on the other. Crane's lawyers presented first. Their argument was technical and detailed and designed to create doubt where the documentation was complex, which was its own kind of strategy, not claiming Caleb's rights were invalid outright, but suggesting the historical record was sufficiently ambiguous to warrant re-examination, which in practice meant delay and opportunity. Then Garner presented Savannah's documentation package. He laid it out methodically. The original survey, the current registration, the timeline, the affidavits. He was a good lawyer, calm and precise, and he knew how to make a set of papers tell a story. But halfway through, board member Cassidy, Crane's friendly acquaintance, exactly as Caleb had suspected, interrupted with a procedural objection about the format of one of the affidavits. The room shifted slightly. Crane's side of the gallery was still. Caleb felt the interruption for what it was, not a genuine concern, but a crack being pried open. Savannah leaned forward and said quietly to Garner, "Page 11. The secondary registration reference. Point to the date stamp." Garner looked at page 11. He nodded slightly and addressed the board, pointing to the date stamp that placed the secondary registration a full 4 months before Crane's people had filed anything in that corridor, which rendered the procedural objection moot on its face. Cassidy sat back. Board member Holt asked 3 questions, each of which was framed in a way that allowed Garner to make the record cleaner rather than more complicated, which Caleb understood as Holt doing the thing a sympathetic board member could do when the documentation was solid and someone was trying to muddy it. The deliberation took 40 minutes. The board upheld the Double R's water rights in full. The review was closed. Crane sat in the gallery while this was read out, and his face did not change, which told Caleb more than a visible reaction would have. A man who lets himself show nothing when he loses is a man who's already decided what he's going to do next. They rode back toward Red Mesa in the afternoon light, and Caleb thought about that expression on Crane's face, and thought about the fire, and thought about the gelding, and thought about what Walt had said about the kind of man who doesn't stop. Savannah, riding beside him on Opal, was quiet for most of the ride back, and when she spoke it was not about the hearing. "He's going to do something else," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Something that can't be handled in a county meeting hall." "Probably." She looked at the road ahead, at the long flat line of the mesa against the late afternoon sky, and he watched her think the way he'd watched her think for months. That quality of attention going inward, turning things over, arriving somewhere. "Then we be ready," she said. It was not a question. It was not even entirely a statement. It was the kind of thing said by someone who has decided, without announcement, that whatever is coming is something they are going to face and not run from, and that this decision has been made and requires no further discussion. He nodded. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that had the particular shape of 2 people who have understood something together. The thing about a man like Crane was that he was patient right up until he wasn't. For 2 weeks after the hearing, nothing happened. The Double R went about its spring work, the West Barn section coming up frame by frame, the East fields planted, the cattle rotation running on the schedule Walt had quietly revised based on Savannah's suggestion in March. Life on the ranch had a momentum to it now, a forward-moving quality that the fire had interrupted but not stopped. And in the careful daily work of rebuilding and planting and carrying on, the crew had found something that functioned like resolve without anyone naming it that. Caleb watched the eastern boundary. He sent Cody out twice a week to check the fence line and report anything unusual. He kept the water rights paperwork in a locked box in his desk rather than the filing cabinet, which was a small precaution but one that cost nothing. He slept lightly. Savannah said nothing more about the conversation at the kitchen table, and neither did he. It existed between them the way a door exists between 2 rooms, present, acknowledged, not yet opened. She was easier with him than before, which he would not have predicted and which he found himself grateful for in a quiet way. The careful distance she had maintained in the early months had softened into something more like the ordinary proximity of 2 people who share a house and a purpose and have stopped rehearsing their interactions before having them. Lily noticed in the way Lily noticed most things and characteristically said something about it. "You and Savannah talk different now," she said to Caleb, on a Sunday morning when she'd come downstairs to find them both at the kitchen table, Caleb with his coffee and Savannah with the accounts ledger, talking about the feed order in the easy shorthand of people who've covered this ground before. "Different how?" Caleb said. "Less careful," Lily said. She sat down and helped herself to a biscuit from the plate in the center of the table with the authority of a person who owns the kitchen by birthright. "Like you stopped deciding what to say before you said it." Savannah looked at the ledger. "You're very observant for someone your age," Caleb told his daughter. "I'm observant for any age," Lily said, which was probably accurate. Mrs. Drummond, who was at the stove and had been conspicuously silent during this exchange, allowed herself a very small sound that might have been a suppressed opinion. The next move came on a Wednesday, and it didn't come from the direction Caleb had been watching. He was in Prescott for a supply run when he ran into Garner outside the courthouse, and Garner had the expression of a man carrying information he wasn't sure how to deliver. "Walk with me a minute," Garner said. They walked. Garner told him that Crane had filed a civil complaint in the county court, not against the ranch directly, but against the work contract between Caleb and Savannah Reed. The complaint alleged that the contract had been obtained under duress, that Savannah had been coerced into signing it by the circumstances of her father's debt, and that the arrangement constituted a form of involuntary servitude prohibited under territorial law. Caleb stopped walking. "He's claiming I coerced her," he said. "He's claiming the contract itself is invalid on its face," Garner said carefully. "It's not a criminal complaint. It's a civil matter. But if the court agrees to hear it, the contract gets scrutinized, and more relevantly—" He paused. "He's listed himself as an interested party on the grounds that Miss Reed's situation is a matter of public concern, which gives him standing to be involved in whatever proceedings follow. He's trying to use a legal action to get access to her," Caleb said. It landed flatly, the way ugly things land when you've half expected them, and they still manage to be worse in their specifics than in your anticipation. "He's trying to invalidate your standing to protect her," Garner said. It's a sophisticated move. I won't pretend otherwise. The territorial courts have seen cases about labor contracts and voluntary consent before, and the argument isn't entirely without precedent. What does it mean practically? It means you need to respond, and the most effective response is— Garner looked at him steadily. "The most effective response is to eliminate the thing he's challenging. If the contract no longer exists, there's nothing to scrutinize." The supply run took another hour, and Caleb did it mechanically, his mind elsewhere the entire time. He rode home in the late afternoon and found Savannah on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl, which was such a specific and ordinary thing to be doing that it struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. The ordinariness of her there, the way the evening light caught her hair, the bowl of peas, the porch of the house she'd come to as nothing and made into something. He sat down on the step and told her. She set the bowl down in her lap. He watched her take it in, the same way he'd watched her take in hard things before. That brief stillness, the internal processing that happened behind her eyes while her face stayed mostly composed. "He's brilliant," she said, which was not what he'd expected her to say. "I know," he said. "He takes something real, the fact that I didn't come here under ideal circumstances, and he wraps it in language that makes you look like the villain." She looked at her hands. "And somewhere in a courtroom, someone who doesn't know any of us has to decide what the truth is." "Garner says the most effective response is to dissolve the contract," Caleb said. "If there's nothing to challenge, the complaint loses its foundation." Savannah was quiet. "It would mean your employment arrangement becomes informal," he said. "We'd have to figure out how to handle your wages, your legal standing on the property. Garner can draw up something less formal that protects you without—" "You'd dissolve the contract," she said slowly, "without waiting for the court to force it." "Yes." She looked at him. There was something in her face that he couldn't entirely read. Not surprise, but the look of someone finding confirmation of a thing they hadn't been certain about. "Why?" "Because it's right," he said. "Because it was supposed to give you freedom, and if Crane can use it against you, then it's doing the opposite of what it was for." He paused. "And because you never needed the contract to be here. That was always your choice." She was still looking at him, and the evening light was soft, and the porch was quiet, except for the sound of the birds coming in off the mesa for the night. "All right," she said, "but I want to be there when you do it. In town, at the county office, properly recorded." "Of course. So it's on record that I'm free," she said. "Not because a court said so or because Crane forced it, because you chose it and I witnessed it." "We'll go tomorrow," he said. She nodded. She picked up the bowl of peas again and went back to shelling them, and Caleb sat on the porch step and watched the light go down behind the mesa, and thought about what free meant for a woman who had never had reason to use the word about herself. They rode into Red Mesa the next morning, Caleb and Savannah and Walt, who came without being asked and offered no explanation for his presence, which was characteristically Walt. The county recorder's office in Red Mesa was run by a clerk named Dugan, a meticulous man who kept his records in a state of order that bordered on personal devotion. He looked at the dissolution document Garner had drawn up the previous evening. Caleb had sent a writer to Prescott at first light, and read it twice with the care of a man who does not like to be surprised by paperwork. "This is straightforward," Dugan said. "Both parties sign, I witness, and record it. The original contract is annotated as dissolved as of today's date." "That's what we need," Caleb said. Dugan laid the document on his desk and turned it toward them. Caleb signed first. He picked up the pen and wrote his name without hesitation, the way he wrote most things. Decided, no revisions. Savannah picked up the pen. She held it for a moment, looking at the paper. Caleb watched her, and he was aware that this was a significant moment, could feel it in the particular stillness of the office, the way Dugan seemed to understand without being told that he should not say anything. And he did not try to hurry it or explain it. She would do this in her own time. She signed. Dugan witnessed it, stamped it, and recorded it in the ledger with the neat efficiency of a man who has been doing this for 30 years. He handed Savannah her copy without comment, which was the correct thing to do. She folded it and put it in her coat. Outside the recorder's office, on the wooden sidewalk of Red Mesa's main street, in the mid-morning light with Walt standing a few feet back studying the sky with intent focus, Savannah stood with the folded paper inside her coat and said nothing for a moment. "How does it feel?" Caleb asked. She thought about it. "Like something I've been holding got set down," she said. "I didn't know how heavy it was until just now." He nodded. "What happens to Crane's complaint now?" she said. "Garner files the dissolution record with the court today. Without a contract to challenge, the complaint has no standing." He paused. "He'll try something else." "Yes," she said. "But this particular thing, he doesn't have it anymore." They were about to go back to the horses when Clara appeared from the direction of the dry goods store, moving with the slightly urgent speed of a woman who has seen something she thinks you need to know about. "He's here," Clara said, keeping her voice low. "Crane? He came in last night, and—" She glanced down the street. "Your father's with him. They're at the saloon." Savannah went very still. "Together," she said. "Sitting at the same table when I passed an hour ago," Clara said. "I don't know what they're talking about." Caleb looked at Savannah. She was looking at the saloon's direction with an expression he'd learned to read. Not fear, not grief. Something more like the hardening of a person who has been waiting for the last piece to show itself. "All right," she said quietly. Not to Clara, not entirely to Caleb either. To herself, maybe. Or to the version of today she'd been preparing for. "You don't have to go near him," Caleb said. "I know I don't." She looked at him. "But I think I should. I think if my father is being used against this ranch and against you, I should be the one to at least look him in the eye and know what we're dealing with." "I'll come with you." "I know you will," she said. They walked down the street together, Walt falling into step behind them, with the quiet purposefulness of a man who has decided a thing and sees no need to announce it. The Dusty Flats was quieter at mid-morning than it had been on the October afternoon when Caleb had first walked into it, but it had the same dim smell and the same quality of held breath that a room takes on when the people in it are aware that something with sharp edges is nearby. Crane was at a table near the back, and he was indeed sitting with Denton Reed, and the picture the two of them made, Crane in his good coat and Reed in his stained one, Crane with his coffee and Reed with his whiskey, was the picture of a transaction, of a man who had found a useful tool and was using it. Crane looked up when they came in. His expression did not change, which was its own kind of message. Reed looked up and flinched slightly, a small, involuntary movement, when he saw his daughter. He had the look of a man who has been drinking since morning, which for Denton Reed meant approximately the same condition as any other morning. And something in his face when he looked at Savannah was complicated in the way that weak people's faces get complicated when they are confronted with the things they have done. Caleb moved to stop beside Savannah, and she moved to the edge of the table, and Tolly behind the bar had very suddenly found something requiring his entire attention in the cabinet below the counter. "Crane," Caleb said. "Ryder," Crane said pleasantly. "This is a coincidence." "No, it isn't," Caleb said. Crane's pleasant expression adjusted itself the way it always did when pretense was dropped. Not dropping the pleasantness entirely, but letting something cooler come through underneath it. "I heard about your contract dissolution," he said. "News travels fast in a small county." "That's true," Caleb said, "which means your court complaint has no standing and you know it." "Legal strategies evolve," Crane said, without apparent concern. "I'm sure Garner told you that." Savannah had not looked at Crane during any of this. She was looking at her father. Reed was looking at the table. "Papa," she said. He looked up. The complicated look in his face got more complicated. "What did he give you?" she said. There was no heat in it, just the flat, direct question of someone who has already decided they can handle the answer. Reed's mouth worked. "Savannah, how much?" A pause.
$50, he said, quietly enough that only the table could hear. For what? He looked at his glass. He wanted me to tell anyone who asked, that you didn't come to the ranch willing, that you were, that Ryder. He stopped. That Ryder coerced me, she said. Reed said nothing, which was the same as yes. She looked at her father for a long moment. She looked at him the way you look at something you've been trying to see clearly for a very long time and have finally managed it, not because it got easier, but because you got strong enough to bear the seeing. You were going to testify in a court that the one man who ever gave me a fair chance had done something wrong, she said. For $50. Reed's jaw worked. I know what you needed, she said. You've always needed it. That's never going to change. She straightened slightly. I'm not angry at you anymore. I've been angry at you for a long time and I'm done with it, but I'm also done protecting you from what you do. She looked at Crane. Whatever he's paid you for, she said, the testimony you were going to give is false, and I will say so under oath in any court you want to put me in. I came to the Double R because I chose to. I stayed because I chose to. And if you put my father on a stand, I will be on the next one contradicting everything he says. She held his gaze. Do you understand me? Crane looked at her for a moment. He had the quality of a man recalculating, which he was always doing, and the recalculation now had the specific character of a man who had not fully expected this and was deciding how to adjust. You're a remarkable woman, he said, and it was said with something that wasn't entirely free of genuine observation. I'm a free woman, she said. There's a difference. She turned and walked back toward the door. Caleb followed. Walt, who had been standing near the entrance with his arms at his sides and his expression conveying nothing whatsoever, held the door. Behind them, the saloon was very quiet. They were halfway down the street when they heard it. The voice came from the saloon's open window, raised, loose with whiskey, the particular volume of a man who has stopped editing himself. Denton Reed's voice. You told me it was just talk, Reed was saying, loud enough to carry through the window and out into the street where 3 or 4 people had paused to listen without appearing to listen. You told me nobody'd get hurt. The barn? Keep your voice down. Crane's voice, sharp, the pleasantness gone entirely. The fire was your idea, Reed said louder. I'm not going to... I said keep your voice down. You paid Hendricks to set it, Reed's voice cracked upward. The whiskey and the confrontation with his daughter and some long-tired part of him conspiring to make him reckless. You paid him in cash at the Alderman property, and I was there when you did it. I was right there. The words were in the air of Red Mesa's main street before Crane could close them back in. Caleb had stopped walking. He turned slowly and looked at the people on the street around him. A woman carrying a basket. 2 men from the feed store who had stepped outside when they heard the raised voices. Old Finch, the barber, standing in his doorway. Clara, who had not gone back to her store. They had all heard it, all of them, and they all knew it. Tully the barkeeper came to his door and stood in it and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who has been a witness to things in his establishment before and understands what it means. Savannah stood beside Caleb, and she didn't say anything, but he felt the quality of her stillness. Not shock, not triumph. Something more like a door closing quietly on a chapter that had been open too long. Somebody get the sheriff, said one of the feed store men, to no one in particular, to everyone in general, to the street and the clear April morning and the 40-odd years of small-town knowledge about who people were and what they were capable of. Caleb looked at Savannah. She was looking at the saloon door. It's over, she said. It wasn't entirely true yet. There would be a sheriff and statements and a long afternoon of telling this story to a man with a small notebook and legal proceedings that would take months, and a father who had finally tripped over his own recklessness in the one way that couldn't be undone. There was still a lot of it left to get through, but the part that had been pressing on all of them since October, the maneuvering and the threats and the fire and the water rights and the civil complaint, that part had just ended in the open air of Red Mesa's main street, witnessed by enough people that no lawyer in the territory could make it go away. Almost, Caleb said. She looked at him. Almost, she agreed. Sheriff Briggs arrived 20 minutes later, by which time Tolly had quietly removed the whiskey from Reed's reach, which was either an act of civic responsibility or the instinct of a man who knew that the next several hours would go better
if the key witness was marginally more sober. Crane had not tried to leave, which might have been calculation. A man making a run for it in front of a street full of witnesses making things worse. Or might have been the particular paralysis of someone whose careful architecture has collapsed faster than they can think. He sat at his table in the dusty flats, while Briggs went through his notes and his questions, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now, replaced by something tight and careful that was the face of a man who has finally run out of adjustments to make. Savannah gave her statement in Briggs's office, which was a small room off the main street that smelled of old paperwork and pipe tobacco. She sat in the chair across from Briggs's desk, and she answered his questions in the same clear, organized way she did everything. Precise, unhurried, complete. Caleb waited outside in the hall. When she came out, she had the look of someone who has set something down that they've been carrying a long way. "He wants to talk to you next," she said.
"How are you?" he said. She thought about the question, actually thought about it, rather than giving him the reflexive answer. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I will be. I think I just need it to be tomorrow, and then the day after that." "That's usually how it works," he said. She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but it was in the vicinity. "Go give your statement," she said. "I'll be here."
He went in. She sat in the hall chair and folded her hands in her lap and waited, and outside the narrow office window, the afternoon light was moving across Red Mesa's main street, and the people on it were going about their ordinary business, which was what people did, and she was part of that ordinariness now in a way she had not been when she stood in this town's saloon in October with her hands folded and her eyes on the floor. She was still sitting there when the door at the far end of the hall opened and two of Briggs's men brought Victor Crane through, his hands not yet in irons but moving in that direction, his expression composed in the way of a man who has decided that composure is the last thing he can control. He passed within a few feet of where she was sitting. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and she did not look away. And there was nothing in her face that was afraid, and nothing that was triumphant either, just the clear, steady regard of a woman who has survived worse than this and knows it. Crane looked away first. They took him through the door at the end of the hall, and the sound of it closing behind them was the most ordinary sound in the world. The days after an ending are strange things. People talk about resolution like it arrives clean. Like the moment the door closes on the bad chapter, the next one opens onto something bright and clear and easier to breathe in. That wasn't how it went for anyone at the Double R. What came instead was a particular kind of exhaustion, the bone-deep fatigue of people who have been braced for impact for so long that when the impact finally stops, their bodies don't immediately believe it. The crew moved through the first week after Crane's arrest with the slightly dazed quality of men who keep checking over their shoulders out of habit and finding nothing there. Victor Crane was held in the county jail pending formal charges. His lawyers arrived from Prescott within 2 days, expensive and efficient, and the legal machinery that followed was the slow grinding kind that takes months and fills rooms with paper. Denton Reed, who had broken open in the dusty flats like a man who had been waiting for someone to give him a reason, was taken into custody as a material witness and subsequently charged as an accessory to the arson. A man named Hendricks, found at a boarding house in Prescott with cash in his boot that matched the amount Crane had been documented withdrawing, was charged with the fire itself. Caleb learned most of this from Garner and from Sheriff Briggs, who came out to the Double R twice in the 2 weeks following to collect additional statements and confirm details. The legal case, Garner said, was solid. Reed's testimony, given before a room full of witnesses who had heard every word through an open window, was a cornerstone that would be very difficult to displace. The cash records, the Prescott boarding house, Hendricks's presence on the Double R road the night of the fire. It assembled into the kind of case that even good lawyers would struggle to dismantle. "You'll have to testify when it goes to trial," Garner told Caleb. "Both of you, most likely." "We'll be there," Caleb said. What he didn't tell Garner, what was harder to account for in any legal proceeding, was what the months had cost in the ways that don't get itemized. The gelding he'd raised from a foal, dead in the fire, the sleep he'd lost, the careful watchfulness that had become so habitual it was going to take time to unlearn. The specific exhaustion on Savannah's face in those first days after, when the adrenaline of confrontation had cleared and left behind only the fatigue of a woman who had spent most of her life in some form of fighting and was not yet sure what to do with the quiet. That particular exhaustion was something Caleb recognized. He had worn it himself years earlier, after his wife died and the grief settled into something chronic, and he had to figure out who he was on the other side of it. You don't step out of that kind of wearing down cleanly. You move through it at the pace it allows, which is slower than you want and faster than it feels. He gave her room. It was the only thing he knew how to offer that was actually useful. Spring moved on into May with the particular generosity of a mesa spring. Not warm exactly, but committed, the cold retreating in increments that you could measure if you paid attention. The West Barn section was framed and roofed by the second week of May, the new timber bright against the older weathered wood of the east structure, a visible seam between what had burned and what had been rebuilt. Caleb had thought about trying to match the wood color, and then decided against it. The seam was honest. The seam was the story. Savannah had gone quiet in a way he was learning to read as different from her early silence. The first month's quiet had been the quiet of a woman conserving herself, not spending energy on anything that wasn't necessary. This was different, more interior, more deliberate, like a person turning something over and examining it from different angles before deciding what to do with it. She did her work, she talked with Lily, she was present at meals and briefings and the ordinary machinery of the household. But there was a quality of inward attention to her that he recognized as someone working something out. He didn't ask about it. He had said what he had to say at the kitchen table in April, and he'd meant the part about not asking for anything, and he intended to keep meaning it. It was Lily, inevitably, who broke the particular stalemate that the two adults in the house were maintaining with such careful mutual consideration. She was 8 years old, and she had approximately zero patience for careful mutual consideration. She came to Caleb on a Thursday evening while he was on the porch, and she sat down next to him with the focused energy of someone who has made a decision and is proceeding with it, and she said, without any preamble, "Are you going to ask Savannah to stay?" Caleb looked at his daughter. "She's been thinking about leaving," Lily said. "She hasn't said so, but I can tell. She gets a certain look when she thinks nobody's watching." "What kind of look? Like someone standing at a window deciding whether to open it?" Lily said this with the unself-conscious confidence of a person who has not yet learned that this level of perception is unusual. She's thinking about whether she has something here or whether she was just here because of circumstances. "She's free to go wherever she wants to go," Caleb said. "That's the whole point." "I know that," Lily said, with the mild impatience she reserved for when adults stated obvious things as if they were profound. "I'm not saying make her stay. I'm saying tell her you want her to." She paused. "There's a difference." Caleb was quiet. "Papa," Lily said. "I'm 8. I can see it. How long do you need?" He looked at his daughter, this small, specific person who had her mother's eyes and her own entirely original way of moving through the world, and felt the particular love that has no adequate description, the kind that makes you want to be better than you sometimes manage to be. "When did you get this way?" he said. "I've always been this way," she said. "You just don't always pay attention." She stood up and brushed off her dress with the practicality of someone concluding a meeting. "She's in the garden," she added, which was either helpful or pointed, or possibly both. The garden was Savannah's addition to the double R, one of the small ways she had made the place incrementally more itself over the months. It occupied a patch of ground behind the kitchen, walled on 2 sides by the house and the woodshed, sheltered enough from the mesa wind to grow things more delicate than the hard ground plants the territory produced naturally. She had started it in late March. Nothing elaborate. Herbs for the kitchen, some vegetables. A few things Mrs. Drummond had specified and a few she'd chosen for herself. She was there in the late afternoon light, kneeling in the dirt beside the bean rows, and she looked up when she heard him come around the corner of the house. "Lily sent you," she said. "That obvious?" "She came and told me you might be coming," Savannah said, with the expression of someone who has made peace with an 8-year-old's particular form of meddling. She said, and I'm quoting, "You should probably just talk to each other." Caleb sat down on the low wall of the woodshed. The afternoon light was doing what it did at this hour on the double R, turning the grass gold and the shadows long, making the whole property look like something a person would choose rather than something they'd stumbled into. "Are you thinking about leaving?" he asked. She sat back on her heels. She had dirt on her hands and a streak of it near her wrist, and she looked at him with the directness she'd grown into over the months, the quality of a woman who has run out of reasons to look at the floor. "I've been thinking about what's next," she said, "which isn't the same thing, but I understand why it might look that way." "What's the difference?" "The difference is that leaving would mean going somewhere. What I've been thinking about is whether staying is something I'm doing because I haven't decided to go, or because it's actually what I want." She pulled a weed from between the bean plants and set it aside. "Those are different foundations." He understood that. He understood it specifically because it was the same question he'd been watching her work through from a careful distance, and he'd told himself he would wait until she had her answer before saying anything further. He still believed that was right. He also believed that Lily, annoyingly, was correct about the other thing. "I want you to stay," he said. "I want to say that plainly, without any conditions around it, and without making it something you need to respond to right now. I want you here because this place is better with you in it, and because Lily would be lost without you, and because I—" He stopped, found the more honest version. "Because I don't want to get used to you not being here. I'm already past the point where that would be easy." Savannah looked at her hands. She turned the pulled weed over, a small, useless gesture, the kind of thing hands do when the mind is somewhere else. "The contract is gone," she said. "Yes. So anything from here would be just a choice. Not an obligation, not a circumstance, just what I actually want." "That's all it would ever be," he said. "I don't have any interest in anything else." She was quiet for a moment, and the garden was quiet around her. And somewhere above the woodshed, a bird was making a sound that was probably a territorial declaration, but in the context felt like something more generous. "I haven't had a lot of practice choosing things," she said, which was probably the most precise and painful thing she had ever said to him. And she said it simply, without self-pity, as a plain fact about her life that she was no longer willing to root around. "Most of what I've done, I did because there was no other option. This is the first time I've been somewhere long enough with enough room to just decide. And I'm not always sure I trust myself to know the difference between what I want and what I'm used to." "That's fair," he said. "I know I want to be here," she said slowly. "I know when I think about not being here, something in me objects to it." She looked up at him. "I know that Lily is the first person in a long time who has wanted things from me that I actually want to give. And I know that you are—" She paused. "You are not what I expected a man to be. I'm still getting used to that." "I'm not perfect," he said. "I'll save you the trouble of finding that out gradually. I'm impatient sometimes, and I work too much, and I'm not always good at saying things before they've been sitting in me so long they come out different than I meant." "I know," she said. "I've been watching you for 7 months. And you're still here." "And I'm still here," she said. Something settled between them. Not dramatic, not the kind of moment people describe later with their hands moving, just a quiet, clear arrival at something that had been approaching for a long time and had finally closed the last of the distance. "Stay," he said, "not because of the ranch or Lily or any obligation, because you want to." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light moved slowly across the garden. "Yes," she said. It was a small word. It carried everything. Tiki. Caleb proposed properly 3 weeks later, which Savannah told him afterward he hadn't needed to do formally, and which he had done anyway because some things deserved the formality, and because he was, under all the practicality, a man who believed that how you began things mattered. He did it at the kitchen table, which was where most of the important things in their life together had happened. The contract signing, the ledger work, the late nights of strategy and planning, the conversations that had built the particular architecture of trust between them brick by brick over months. It seemed right that the kitchen table should be present for this one too. He had a ring that had been his grandmother's, a plain band with a small stone that caught the light without making a production of it, which seemed like the right kind of ring for Savannah. He set it on the table between them without a speech, because he'd tried writing a speech and it had come out sounding like someone else, and instead he said, "I'd like to be with you for a long time, if you'll have me." She looked at the ring. "That's it?" she said. "I had more," he said. "It wasn't any good." She laughed. That same surprised laugh she'd produced the first evening at the table, when Lily had asked if she could stay forever, and Savannah had laughed without meaning to, the laugh of someone discovering that their face still knows how to do this. 7 months later, it was less surprised, but no less real.
Yes, she said, for the second time in 3 weeks. And she picked up the ring and looked at it in the kitchen light, and whatever she was feeling showed plainly on her face, which it did more and more these days, the long habit of concealment loosening its hold in increments. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Drummond told me." He looked toward the kitchen. Mrs. Drummond was very occupied with the stove. "She talks more than she lets on," Savannah said. "I've suspected that for years," he said. They married in September, 5 months later, when the barn was fully rebuilt, and the west section smelled of new timber and the territory had shifted into the particular gold of early autumn. They married inside the new structure because Caleb had suggested it, and Savannah had agreed without needing to explain why. The barn was the thing that had burned and been rebuilt, and that felt right. Some places earn their meaning through what they survive. It was not a large wedding. It was never going to be a large wedding. Neither of them had the particular appetite for spectacle that makes people want their significant moments witnessed by hundreds of strangers. What they had instead was the people who had been part of the story, the crew of the Double R, who dressed in their best and still looked like ranch hands in church clothes, which was the correct look for them. Mrs. Drummond, who wore a hat she'd apparently been saving for an occasion, and who cried briefly and pretended she hadn't. Clara from the dry goods store, and Miss Adler, the schoolteacher, and Fowler from the neighboring ranch with his oldest boy. Jessup from the county land office, whose wife had become Savannah's friend. A handful of others who had shown up with tools on a Saturday in April and stayed until the light failed. And Lily. Lily wore a blue dress and had her hair braided in a style Savannah had taught her, and she stood beside Savannah through the ceremony with the solemn focus of a person taking a role seriously. When it was done, the word said, the ring moved from engagement to marriage on Savannah's hand. Lily took Savannah's other hand in both of hers and held it, which wasn't something anyone had asked her to do, and which was therefore exactly right. Savannah looked down at her. "Okay," Lily said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. "Good." Savannah laughed, and then she was crying, which surprised her, the way good things sometimes still surprised her, ambushing her in the moment she least expected, catching her off guard with the evidence that her life had become something she had not imagined possible. She had learned over the past year that allowing yourself to be surprised by goodness was different from trusting it blindly. It was the harder skill. It required keeping yourself open in a way that had always felt like risk, had always felt like something a person with her history couldn't afford. She was learning that she could afford it. Slowly, imperfectly, with the occasional backslide into old habits of watchfulness that Caleb had learned to recognize and simply wait out. But she was learning. The trial happened the following spring, 14 months after Crane's arrest. It was not the dramatic courtroom confrontation of the kind that gets simplified into stories later. It was procedural and long and frequently tedious, and Savannah and Caleb both testified on separate days and sat through other people's testimonies on several more. Reed's confession, properly deposed and entered into the record, was as central as Garner had predicted. Hendricks had made a deal with the county prosecutor that reduced his sentence in exchange for corroborating testimony about Crane's involvement, which Crane's lawyers contested and the jury ultimately accepted. Victor Crane was convicted of arson, conspiracy to commit arson, and 2 counts of fraudulent interference with county land records, a secondary charge that Garner had built from the evidence of the water rights maneuvering, which had involved Crane's people submitting documentation they knew to be misleading. He was sentenced to 7 years. Denton Reed was convicted as an accessory and sentenced to 18 months, with consideration given for his cooperation. Caleb told Savannah the verdicts in the kitchen, which was where they told each other things. She listened, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, 7 years? Yes. He'll be an old man when he gets out. Yes. She looked at her coffee cup. I don't feel what I thought I'd feel, she said. What did you think you'd feel? Something bigger, she said. More, she searched for it. I thought it would feel like the end of something, but it mostly just feels like the closing of a chapter I'd already stopped reading. He understood that too. He'd learned over the years that justice and satisfaction were not always the same thing, and that expecting them to arrive together was how people ended up spending their lives waiting for something to feel finished. The thing was already finished.
had been finished since September, or since the day she signed her name in the county recorder's office, or since the morning she'd said yes in the garden with dirt on her hands. What the verdict gave them was the legal fact of it. The emotional fact had been settled a long time ago. "Your father?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I wrote him a letter last week," she said, "before the verdict. I told him I wasn't going to the sentencing. I told him—" She paused. "I told him I wasn't angry anymore, that I'd meant that when I said it in the saloon, and that when he gets out, if he decides to be a different kind of person, I'd be willing to know him, but that I wasn't going to wait for it." "That's generous," Caleb said.
"I don't know if it is," she said. "Maybe it's just practical. Carrying that kind of anger takes something from you. I've spent enough years giving things to him that he didn't deserve."
There was a particular wisdom in that which Caleb thought he'd known in theory for a long time and had never heard said so precisely. Some things you put down not because they weren't real, but because you've decided what they're worth holding at the expense of. Savannah had spent years having that calculation made for her, having other people decide what she was worth and what she owed and how much of herself she should spend on them. She was making it herself now. That was the thing, Caleb had come to understand, that mattered more than any single event in the story of the past 14 months. Not the fire or the hearing or the confrontation in the saloon, not even the wedding, though he would cherish that until he ran out of days. The thing that mattered was the steady, imperfect, daily work of a woman learning to occupy her own life as if it belonged to her. Because it did, and it always had, and the fact that the world had spent so long telling her otherwise was the real crime, the one that never made it to any courtroom. The double R ran well in the years that followed, not without difficulty. A hard winter 2 years after the trial that pushed the cattle count lower than Caleb was comfortable with. A dispute with a neighboring property over a shared fence line that took 6 months to resolve. A season where the Eastfield yield was disappointing enough that Savannah spent 3 evenings poring over the soil records she'd been keeping since her first year on the ranch, looking for what had gone wrong and finding it, adjusting, trying again. These were the ordinary difficulties of a working life, and they were dealt with as such. Lily grew into the version of herself that had always been visible if you knew where to look. Sharp, direct, genuinely curious about everything, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and something all her own that neither of them could fully account for. She left for school in Prescott at 14, which she had decided she wanted and had argued for with such thorough preparation that Caleb had found himself agreeing before he'd fully intended to. She wrote letters home that were long and detailed and characteristically opinionated, and came back for summers and holidays, and brought her ideas and her friends and her evolving sense of the world back to the kitchen table where the important things had always happened. Savannah learned to read a grazing report with the same competence she'd brought to the accounts ledger. She learned which of the hands needed managing and which needed leaving alone, and the difference between a problem that wanted to be solved and one that wanted to be witnessed. She made 2 more friends in town and 1 genuine enemy, which she felt was a reasonable ratio for a life honestly lived. She made mistakes, lost her temper once with a hand who deserved it, and once with Caleb, who didn't, not exactly, and had to apologize in the specific awkward way of a person who is still learning that being wrong doesn't mean being worthless. She stopped flinching at loud noises somewhere in the 2nd year. Not gradually. One day she noticed she hadn't done it in some time and couldn't mark when it had stopped. That was how healing worked, she had found. Not a single moment of restoration, but a slow accumulation of ordinary days that didn't hurt, until the ordinary was the rule instead of the exception. The double R earned its reputation over those years, not for size, not for spectacle, but for the quality of what it produced and the way it operated, for the fact that hands who came to work there tended to stay, which in the frontier territory was the most reliable indicator of whether a place was worth working. Fowler's oldest son stayed 2 seasons and then bought his own land 12 miles east. Cody married a woman from Red Mesa and built a house on the property's edge and was there for 15 years, which was practically a founding story in itself. Walt remained until he was 63, at which point he declared himself finished with winters and moved to a town in the lowlands and sent a letter twice a year that contained on average 14 words. They missed him with a constancy that surprised no one who knew what Walt had been to the place. There are things that stories leave out, because stories need shape, and shape requires selection. What gets left out is usually the ordinary material, the breakfast, the fence repairs, the Tuesday afternoons that don't mean anything except that they happened, and you were in them, and you were alive. The arguments that got resolved, and the silences that didn't need resolving. The specific weight of a sleeping 8-year-old against your arm on a porch at 3 in the morning while something terrible burned in the dark, and you held on and waited. What Savannah understood, in the way that people understand things when they've had enough ordinary days to look back across, was that the life she'd found at the Double R had not been given to her. Not by Caleb's decision in a saloon in October, not by the contract, not by the legal dissolution of that contract, not by any single act of intervention or rescue. Those things had opened a door. She had walked through it herself and kept walking, and done the daily incremental work of becoming a person who expected to be treated as one. That was the only story worth telling, she thought. Not the fire, not the courtroom, not the wedding in the new timbered barn, but the ordinary miracle of a woman who had been told for 20 years that she was worth nothing, deciding one day at a time that this was not true. The world is full of men like Crane, who mistake leverage for power, and men like Denton Reed, who trade what they love for what they want, and they leave damage behind them that takes years to repair and sometimes never fully heals. But the world is also full of kitchen tables, and morning briefings, and 8-year-old girls who want their hair braided and have questions that deserve real answers, and neighbors who show up with tools on a Saturday, and the slow companionship of a man who learned that the land he'd spent his life building was nothing compared to the person who helped him understand what it was for. You don't get to choose what you start with, but you get to choose every ordinary day what you're building toward. Savannah Reed, who became Savannah Ryder in a rebuilt barn on a September afternoon with dirt still on her hands from the morning's work, understood this the way she understood the accounts ledger and the water rights documentation and the difference between what a person owes you and what they freely give. You could not put a price on the freely given things. You could only make sure when they arrived that you were ready to receive them, and that you had done the work, the hard, unglamorous daily work of becoming someone who knew their own worth well enough to believe they deserved them. That was the lesson the Double R taught her, one ordinary day at a time. That was the only lesson that mattered.